Wait room from now on. We have over 120 participants at this time. We'll continue to let folks in, but you're right. I know y'all will be using all 3 hours for the session and a lot of ground to cover today. No pun intended. I am excited to introduce our speakers today and our facilitator. My name is Kendall Tyree. I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. This is by far one of our best attended and certainly a topic that so many folks have requested. If you can go ahead and ensure you stay on mute for me to help us with any background noise. And as so many of you are doing, please make sure that you've logged your attendance in our chat box. Many of you have also included your nutrient management planner number. If you need CEUs, please note that there for us also. We'll be marrying our chat box with our registration list and providing that information to the appropriate folks to get you those CEUs. You should have received an email this morning from Maura Christian if you had registered by around 8 o'clock. That is a copy of both David Bryan's presentation, so you could print and include notes on it this morning, as well as a 2-pager handout that will really follow along with Chris Lawrence this morning. Those will also be posted on our website along with a recording of this session later today, and Maura Christian will be sending out an email to all the participants to provide you with those resources again afterwards. At this time, I'm going to toss it over to Wayne Davis. He is the association's second vice president, as well as a director in Colonial Soil and Water District. And I am really privileged to have been able to work with him to plan this phenomenal session that I know it will be. So Wayne, if you'd like to kick off.
Good morning, everybody. It's so good to see so many familiar names and faces. Kendall and I are definitely looking forward to this. We've got 3 excellent speakers. I'll say up front that it's our intent with the limited time that we have this morning, if the evaluations reflect what we think they're going to reflect, we will probably have additional training sessions on this topic. It's just hard to cover everything that we feel like the attendees need to know on this in the limited period of time that we have. The 3 speakers, as you probably know, are Chris Lawrence. Of course, most of you on this training session know Chris. Chris works with NRCS. He's the state cropland agronomist, and he's been in that position since 2004. And Chris takes the lead role with all the statewide technical trainings for his staff as well as partners. And we're very pleased to have him here this morning. In addition, we have David Bryan. David works with Department of Conservation and Recreation. He's the Ag Incentives Program Manager, and he oversees our important VACS cost share program. And you'll be hearing from him a little later this morning, specifically talking about the cover crop practices. And last, we have Bob Warren. Most of y'all know Bob. Bob is a nutrient management planner with DCR. Also, he is a farmer in Essex County, works with his father, Brandon Farms. And I can tell you firsthand that Bob and his father allow a lot of research to be done on their farm. They work both closely with NRCS, Three Rivers District, as well as Virginia Tech and others, putting on research to further advance production agriculture, specifically as it relates to cover crops and understanding how they work and the benefit that they provide. And it's important that we have operations like that are willing to open up and share their knowledge on what is learned from those replicated plots. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris and let him take it from here. Chris?
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So thank you so much for introducing me and the other speakers. Thank you for hosting this. Everyone out there, I want to remind you that Zoom, we become spoiled and assume everything's going to be great. So please be patient if something goes wrong with the technology. I also want you to know that the moderators who you just heard from, they will be monitoring the chat box and so forth. I can't see that. So they may jump in and interrupt me if needed. I want to thank the team here for giving me a big nudge to work on this cover crop training with you. There is a huge need is my opinion. There's a huge need for this kind of training. I have not done any training like this in Virginia for at least 18 months. We are just stretched a little thin, but this is the number one thing I enjoy teaching, and I look forward to maybe doing more with you on this. I'm going to be trying a new approach today to some extent, and as always, it's a work in progress. So I'm always looking, I'll say it again multiple times, I'm always looking for your input. The last thing is that, I'm speaking for NRCS. You'll notice DCR's logo is on the screen. And in between some of our different programs, you may see some slight differences, and we're trying, if you have questions about any aspect of that, you can contact me. Of course, David Bryan, who you'll hear from more later. So with that, I'm going to try to advance my slides here and get into part one. We've divided up this webinar into 3 parts, and the first part is really going to be more of a traditional lecture, and the title is Virginia NRCS Top 20 with a question mark technical tips. Why top 20? Because we might not cover, well, I know I'm not going to cover all 20 in the hour roughly that I have ahead of me. This handout I developed for this class, and it was distributed to you all, and I think there might be some merit in printing it out. I don't know if you've had the chance to do it yet, but printing it out. My idea here is to give you a framework, to give all of us maybe a framework for cover crops A to Z. Put it on just 2 sides of a page so that one sheet of paper can cover it. And my goal today is for you guys to see this approach, chew on it some, give me some feedback. And really my presentation for the next 50 minutes or so is going to be to pick some of these, what I'm calling technical tips, and explain to you what they're about. And I'm not going to cover every tip today because I don't have time, but I picked some that I think are most important to help frame up this cover crop question. And what I'm actually pleased to be able to say is that we if you like this framework, if it makes sense, we can come back and go back into some of these tips the next time. So might be useful to have this handy, but this gives you a sense of sort of the numbering of the points I'm going to make. So let's talk about point number 1. What you need to know is a lot to cover. And you might hear some puns with the word cover and cover crop and crop. What you need to know is a lot to cover. There's a lot of technical information about cover crops out there. And to really learn what you need, it's going to take more than passive webinar watching. You need to actively read. This is an example of a book that if you're professionally involved in cover crops, you should obtain this book. You can get it PDF for free online. We can also get you a low-cost copy pretty easily. Published by USDA SARE, 3rd edition of this book. Doesn't tell you everything, but it provides that core foundation of 300 pages of background that you're going to need. But maybe even more important, you have to ask questions. You need to get out on farms and talk to people. You'll hear from a farmer today who also works for DCR, but that's not enough. You got to get out there and educate yourself about what's happening locally. But finally, and most importantly, I strongly recommend that you plant your own cover crops and watch them grow. Now, many folks on the line, including myself, are not farmers. And it's wonderful to work with farmers and ride on their drill as you're planting cover crops with them, and making sure that, as you're planting a strip of cover crop seed, that seed doesn't run out, and you really actively engage with them. But you don't have to do that, okay? So here's a photograph of something everyone can do. This is, you can see 2013, 5 weeks after planting, just 4 buckets, right? With some holes in the bottom. You get the Miracle Grow. I use the Miracle Grow brand potting medium with the fertilizer in it. You just get it from Home Depot or Lowe's. You need the cover crop seed, but you can learn how these cover crops grow, okay? And you see at the bottom, forage radish, spring oats, canola, Phacelia. You can learn about them, and you can carry these to folks and help them learn. So farmers don't do this. And it's a way for you to build a level of expertise and be different that will help you, even if you're brand new to this. So just, you know, a few months later, you can learn, same buckets, guys. You can learn which of these crops tends to winter kill and which doesn't. So get out there and plant them and watch them. And this is one example. I'll show some others of how you can do that. Okay, so the next point, I skipped one of my top tips. Let's go to tip number 3. And this is golden rule number 1. Know what you don't know. I said there's a lot to know, and it can be very intimidating. But it's important to know what you don't know. That's your golden rule. And I wrote here, yes, this applies to you, even if you're not so new. So it is extremely important that even our experienced folks not get complacent or overconfident. And so I use this analogy here of a swimming pool. You know, cover crop knowledge, there's a pool here, and any given day you'll have a question. You need to swim across it, you know, and you just have to know where you are. So the pool can get deep. You just have to know which end you're jumping into. And if you're out of your depth, you can still cross, right? You just need to know enough to ask for help. So if you get into the really tough cover crop questions, you feel like you're in the 12 foot and you don't know how to get across, that is an example of something that I'm here for. And other folks who are on the call today are here for. If you interact with us, we not only help you, but you teach us what's going on and what's needed. So, you know, I'm out here, David's out here, Bob's out here, Wayne is out here, maybe. Don't want to speak too much for you, Wayne, but anyway, that's the golden rule. Know what you don't know. Okay, next point. Cover crop has many meanings, that term, and you got to know which one you're talking about. So this is my recommendation. When you hear a sort of vague use of the term cover crop, where you hear yourself in talking to someone saying, well, cover crops do this, or you get paid for this cover crop, if you don't have additional clarification, if you don't know whether that person's talking about programs, NRCS programs, or is it DCR programs, or is it just a purely technical question, this is a red flag. Okay, we have to define our terms so we know what each other is talking about. And cover crop is a term that often means different things to different people. A lot like no-till, maybe some other terms like delicious. Okay, what's delicious to me may not be delicious to you. But it is useful to start with a broad technical definition, and that's what I'm going to do today, is offer a broad technical definition. But remember always that my definition may not be what the conversation is about. Okay, so let me use a graphic here to, and again, moderators, if I say here's a graphic and it doesn't come up, let me know. But I'm going to give you this graphic, conceptual, right? It's just purely conceptual to help you understand how I see the world of cover crops versus what I'm calling money crops. When I say money crop, I'm saying a crop that's primarily grown to be harvested and sold. But I'm not saying cash crops or harvested crops because, you know, cover crops can potentially, at least in some cases, be harvested. So I'm offering here in the center of the screen a very broad technical definition for us to work off of today. A cover crop is a crop grown primarily, but not exclusively, primarily to benefit the soil, the environment, or other crops in the rotation. But as it says, not exclusively. So it could be okay in some cases for harvesting to be compatible with the cover crop's purpose. All right, and both NRCS and DCR accept that idea. But NRCS national policy says that some forms of harvesting, particularly for grain, are not allowed. So our technical definition of cover crop with NRCS, it's defined by 340 or 340 standard, cover crop standard. Actually, that subset of cover crops is a little smaller than the broader technical definition, okay, that I offered, because it's harvested for grain, even if it doesn't impair the cover crop's function, NRCS just doesn't call it a cover crop. So we start to get into the legalese here, and it gets a lot deeper. Let me show you this, for example. We focus on the NRCS side. We have an EQIP program, FA Financial Assistance Program. Well, before 2020, we wouldn't offer any FA under EQIP for something that was harvested, right? So that subset, and it was a narrow subset of cover crops that we would pay for under EQIP. Well, we've kind of changed that, and last year and now we're trying to go for a broader scope. So look at just how confusing this kind of starts to look. But we haven't talked about the DCR elements either. So we look at SL8H, the harvestable cover crop. It actually falls over here, right? And actually, it's a little bit outside of the NRCS official scope of our 340, because you can, under DCR's program, you can pay folks to harvest certain cover crops for grain, potentially. Of course, that doesn't mean they're not that doesn't mean they don't not fulfilling good cover crop functions, right? It's just differences in approach. And so we start adding sort of these other circles for some of the other BMPs, right? If this seems, if it looks overwhelmingly confusing, it's because you guys have a lot to navigate when it comes to the definitions of cover crops, depending on whether it's programs or technical, who you're talking to, and even which spec you're working off of, whether it's old spec or new spec, whether it's SL8 or SL8B or WQ4. This is part of why you guys, are specialists in this, because it's complicated. But remember, for the rest of this presentation, I am going to be talking about a broad technical definition of cover crops as something grown primarily, but not exclusively, to benefit the soil, the environment, or other crops in the rotation. In contrast with money crops that are really not grown primarily for those reasons, grown primarily for money. Okay, so let's roll on. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this tip, which is that I recommend you don't confuse the cover crop practice with the covered soil principle. What the heck is Chris Lawrence talking about? I'm going to propose to you that our overall goal as conservationists is not to have more cover crops, but to have more covered soil. And ideally, we'll achieve that by mimicking nature with continuous living biomass above the ground and abundant roots growing below the ground. Now, I am going to show you, build on a diagram that I created. I don't know if the animations will work. I don't, be patient with me. But it's sort of how I understand in my mind the value of covered soil. Notice I didn't say cover crop. I said covered soil. So here we have bare soil, and I'm showing you kind of a soil profile. And it rains on that bare soil. What happens? Okay, we get runoff, and we also get erosion. Also, when you have bare soil, an example of something that happens, weeds come in. Mother Nature abhors a vacuum, right? She's going to fill that with weeds or something. So what happens during the growth of the crop that we're going to plant? And notice I didn't say cover crop. I just want to cover the soil. I plant, and my plants grow and start to cover the soil, may even go to maturity. I might even put some greater diversity of plants out there. I am starting to intercept raindrops, right? And I'm also starting to contribute a layer of residue or armor to the soil surface. We cover the soil with living plants, hopefully abundant plants on top. We stop runoff. We also stop erosion. And with competition out there against the weeds and residue to snuff out weed seeds from germinating, we fight weeds. So this is some of the above ground benefits to the conservation agronomist, right? Which all of you work in agronomy and conservation, agronomy, crop and soil science. This is the above ground benefit. What's happening below ground? Hopefully, you're asking yourself. So here's what's happening below ground is we're putting down roots. And this is invisible. It's something you really need to have at the forefront of your mind. What do these root systems do for us? Well, There is a lot of loose nitrogen in both ammonium and nitrate form down there. And these roots will pull that up, right? So we are fighting against leaching and loss of nutrients that way, an environmental and potentially an economic benefit. There's other nutrients down there. There's potassium, there's sulfur. We can pull those up as well. And part of the mechanism by which we are preventing this stuff from leaching out is we're not just pulling up the nutrients, y'all, we're also pulling up the water. So an important idea is that when we have covered soil with living plants, we not just catch or pull in the nutrients, but we mitigate the transport mechanisms, right? So as you saw up here, we're minimizing runoff and we're minimizing downward movement of water. We're minimizing the transport as well as the availability of the pollutants or nutrients. Okay, so what about compaction, right? I've added this little visual here. These roots are going to open up the soil with many benefits to the farmer and how well the soil functions. What about all this organic matter? Where is it coming from? Well, we're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which has its own benefits for climate change, but we're not going to focus on that right now. We're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere with these plants. With these legumes, we're also pulling nitrogen out of the atmosphere, okay? And when you bring in organic matter and you don't have, and you have some nitrogen fixation as well, you're creating organic matter. What is that going to do over time? Folks, that's going to improve the soil. So I hope these visual aids are helping you. It's getting pretty complex right now, right? But I hope it's helping you understand the logic of why covered soil, covered with abundant plants and vigorous roots underneath, do so much for us. So this is during the crop growth phase, right? This is while our plants that we've planted are growing. What about after they die? So here we have our small grain and its nest. It provides a benefit, okay? Covering the soil with plants provides a benefit even after the plants die, because that residue creates a mat, okay? And you can see our next crop, let's call it our cash crop here of soybeans growing. That mat of residue is going to prevent erosion, prevent runoff. It's going to reduce evaporative loss, and it's going to keep the soil cooler, okay? It's also going to help suppress weeds. So we need to think about this covered soil principle helps us while the plants we're growing are growing and also after we terminate. The last thing I want to add here is this idea, okay, that depending on, there's another purpose, right, to covering the soil with cover crops or potentially cash crops. This fixation of nitrogen gives us a little bit of a different phenomenon than what you see down here. If we have legumes, right, our residues may be, you can see these are a little bit greener than the ones down at the bottom. Our residues may be more easily degraded. They may not last as long, but they're going to allow us to cycle nitrogen, right? So we can fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere with cash crops or with other crops, and we can contribute nitrogen to the subsequent crop. Okay, so that's another purpose. And then in some situations, that organic N is not going to cycle as readily. This seems to be an extremely complex visual aid, but I hope by walking you through it, you know, it helps you, maybe this helps you be a little bit less intimidated when you see a long list of the different things that cover crops and covered soil can do for us. But let me ask this question, and this is the harvest question, okay? If I will ask, how many of these covered soil benefits that we just went through will occur if we just take the grain off the top of these stalks? I would submit that there'd be a lot of benefits that we will still potentially get, right? Maybe not all of them. What about if we take in these annual plants, if we take the fodder or the straw, the forage, the biomass, if we take the biomass off, do we still get the benefits that we got during the growth phase? Yeah, and we still might get some benefits post. We won't have as much residue on the surface, so that will be a trade-off, okay? And then my last question is, imagine that this stand of vegetation is perennial. Imagine it's perennial pasture. Imagine it's perennial hay. What benefits would still occur to the soil and our system if we were just mowing the biomass off or grazing it off and then allowing regrowth? So, what are the conclusions from the harvest question? I submit to you that there are multiple strategies we can use to reach our covered soil goal. We want to keep the soil covered. Annual cover crops, which is the main focus for today, no doubt, and main focus for all our programs, is only one way, right? So some harvested money crops can fulfill the same purposes as cover crops. That's why cover crop harvesting is allowed under some of the specs and so forth. But perennial forage crops are the master, if you will, of the harvestable crops that can provide us with that covered soil benefit. And so here's an image from the Shenandoah Valley, alfalfa, corn silage on a dairy. I've noted here, livestock can dramatically enhance our options for keeping the soil covered, even if we don't have cover crops in the system. So here's a rotation diagram. I know I'm flying pretty fast here, but I'm going to introduce to you this idea of a rotation diagram. You can see across the top, okay, we've got our seasons of the year starting in the spring, and then we've got our 12 months of the year. And then we've got our years going down, each row is a year. So in year one, we're finishing up our alfalfa portion of the rotation, but we go to corn silage, right? And we plant small grains, that's year one. We swing back the small grain, grows these last couple months of the calendar, and then it's harvested for silage on this dairy. Then we're going to plant soybeans. Maybe they'll be roasted, maybe they'll be sold off the farm. After the soybeans, we chase the combine with the drill again, and we're planting small grain for silage again. Okay, come back in year three, another year of corn silage. Then we come in, put some alfalfa hay in with a small grain nurse crop. And that alfalfa hay, we're going to do something which is not that common, but I know a few farmers who do it. And I know a gentleman, Richard Fitzgerald, for instance, on the phone, I saw he was on today. He'll tell you more about it. You can overseed small grain into that alfalfa to boost your yield. So this is a 6-year rotation, right? But there's no cover crops in here, but we can very effectively keep the soil covered. So the reason I'm highlighting this is that here's a different rotation diagram. Continuous corn and soybeans. I've got no cover crops in there. And this is what Bob Waring grows, and we'll talk about in the second hour of our webinar today. But what I want to show you is that, when you have a simpler cash crop lineup, you don't have livestock that can eat a wide range of forages, you're much more limited in how you can keep the soil covered. And so one way to think about what cover crops are is they are a substitute for the forage crops that are grown on more traditional farms that have livestock. And a cover crop would normally get fed to livestock or grazed on what I consider a traditional, the traditional model of a more balanced livestock crop farm. But when we only have crops, we have to use cover crops if we want to get that sort of full coverage of the soil over time. So I thought that might be a useful way to frame this up for you. I'm just getting rolling. I hope that it's coming through well, but that concept of covered soil and the benefits we get from it is really the foundation of everything else I'm going to try to share with you today. And not hearing my moderator stop me, I'm going to go to point number 6 or tip number 6. And that is that when you're thinking about cover crops, you want to start with the end in mind. You want to think about the purpose for which it's being grown. And so my suggestion for categorizing purposes, as you see here, is 1 general long-term purpose and 9 specific short-term purposes. There are lots of different books and fact sheets and stuff that list the purposes of growing cover crops, for in different ways. What you need to know is that my way is the best way. No, that's not. But the most important thing to know about cover crop purposes is that it's important to understand them. And often the lists we see and the charts we see, they don't promote understanding. And it's just one of those things you're going to have to study on and think about. So I showed you all the functions that covering the soil with living plants can do both during the growth phase and after termination. And so I'm going to add even more by showing you now what I consider or propose are 9 specific short-term purposes for growing cover crops. So let's assume the plants now that are shown here are just cover crops. Reduce soil erosion and runoff. That was a no-brainer. I showed you how that happens both in the growth phase and in the post-termination phase if we leave the residue on the surface. Scavenge and recycle soil nitrogen. I showed you that here, right? Makes sense. We're sucking up and out of the ground, scavenging and recycling other nutrients, right? So potash, sulfur, phosphorus, whatever. If you notice this pattern, what we're doing with the cover crops is we're drawing resources from under the ground and above the ground into the growth zone. This is the concept, is we're creating organic matter above ground and in the topsoil. This is where we want all of our resources here. It's better for the environment, it's better for the farmer. Also, fixing and recycling atmospheric nitrogen. I demonstrated this or tried to show it here. This nitrogen coming in out of the atmosphere above you is 78% roughly nitrogen. There's a lot of nitrogen there, but it's not reactive. Legumes working in symbiosis with certain bacteria, and there are other mechanisms as well that microbes in particular allow us to take nitrogen out of the air, put it in an organic form that can be used, and then it can actually be used to feed the next crop, right? Alleviate compaction is another function. Help manage soil moisture and temperature. We talked about minimizing evaporative loss when we have a nice mat on the surface. Suppressing weeds, cover that. We get into suppressing soil pests, boosting above ground biology. This is some potential other other factors, or rather other potential uses, but 9 purposes. Okay, if you really want to be a proper cover crop planner, you have to spend some time sort of internalizing these, understanding how these work. Perhaps this diagram is a start on helping you do that. So 9 short term, what's the 1 long term, or what I call general purpose? And what I mean by short term is that if I plant, it's possible that by planting a single season of cover crop, just 1 season of cover crop, I can make a dent in some of these purposes, okay? That's the idea. I would like to grow cover crops every year and improve over time, but you can make an impact on any of these purposes potentially in a single year if you're very focused in your cover cropping. The one, what I'm calling general or long-term purpose, we improve soil health and function, right? By keeping the soil covered, minimizing soil disturbance, maximizing living roots, and adding diversity to the system. That's the idea of building the soil. And you're not going to build organic matter in a measurable, appreciable way with a single cover crop. Okay, that takes time, and it takes a whole system, not just cover crops, but cover crops can be a big part of it. So, a couple of other things about purposes. And this is, again, you might be like, well, Chris, I can't keep up with this. It's all on this tip sheet. Just about every word that's on these slides is on that 2 sides of a page tip sheet. So remember, the goal here is for you guys to use the top 20. My goal today, excuse me, is to use this presentation just to help you understand what I mean by some of those top tips. So one of the things you'll see under the heading of purposes is this idea that a single species or a single cover crop mix can fulfill many purposes. I mean, look at this. Let's pretend or assume this is rye. Look at all the stuff that this rye cover crop can do for us. It's amazing, but it can't do everything, okay? It can't fix nitrogen, right? Meanwhile, if we focus on fixing nitrogen, we're not going to be as good as at certain other things. Okay, so the idea here is that if your purpose is relatively general, I want to improve the soil, you could use a wide range of cover crops, but the more specific your priority is, right? If you're very focused, let's say, on this idea of I want to fix atmospheric nitrogen and I want it to be available to the next crop right away. That is a very specific purpose, and you're going to have to be more focused on that purpose when you make your selections and your planning, as it says right here. The more priority you put on purpose, the more you need to focus on it. So that's tip number 6. We're kind of wrapping up. Start with the end in mind. Know your purposes. We went over them. I'm just putting them back up here. Let's now talk about how do we best achieve those purposes. And
Hey,
this is,
hey, Chris,
yes, go ahead.
not to interrupt you, but I've got 2 quick questions that have come in.
Sure.
Could you take them now? The first one is, what does small grain nurse crop refer to? That's the first one. And the second one is, how can districts engage farmers to increase participation in planting cover crops behind soybeans?
So the first question is very technical, and I will try to do it justice. When we plant a perennial in the fall, like fescue or alfalfa, we can plant an annual crop with it. So in the same drill or broadcast at the same time. And the annual, we call it a nurse crop because it grows more quickly. It helps shade out weeds a little bit. It provides some protection to the seedlings of the perennial. And then, you know, in the coming fall, in the coming spring rather, the small grain will you know, start to mature. It can be harvested off, leaving the pure alfalfa stand or fescue stand behind. The second question, how do we get more cover crops behind soybeans? This whole presentation is built towards us addressing that question with Bob Waring. That is a very difficult question to answer. And so you're gonna stick with me, and we're gonna try to show you how Bob Waring is getting more cover crops behind his soybeans. How we doing?
Excellent,
Right.
Chris. Thank you.
You with me?
Mhm.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I know we got 100 people on here. We don't want to do a lot of housekeeping, but at least were the visual aids running through okay.
Perfect.
Great. You got a lot of compliments in the chat box.
So let's go on to tip 7. This is an important idea. It's really very simple, but most cover crop benefits are biomass driven, okay? So the more cover crop growth we get above and below ground, or above, below ground or below ground or both, right? The better things work, okay? And just look at this right here. You see these little plants that I'm circling? Look at their root systems, okay? So if you want a weak cover crop, you're not going to do as much as if you've got a nice, vigorous cover crop. Does that make sense? It seems pretty obvious. Now on that post cover crop side, if you really want a thick mat that's going to keep the soil, you know, covered during those super hot days and snuff out weeds, you need more biomass. So generally, more yield equals better cover crop outcomes. And as I say here, there is this idea, I think, that if we starve plants, then they will hunt deeper in the soil for nutrients. And we can talk about some of the finer points there, but generally, if you want to maximize the plant's expression above and below ground of its genetic potential, you're going to have to ensure that it's not lacking for too much. Okay, I'm going to give you an example that firsthand experience that I have. So this is my wife's in our house. Here's 2015, and this is what she's telling our neighbor who called. You know, no, these are not missile silos against the house. It's just another one of my husband's crazy projects. So I wanted to see in one fall season how deep of a cover crop root I could have grow. But I wanted a pot that was 10 feet deep. So I put these 10-foot tall PVC pipes against the house, and I planted rapeseed and one plant of rapeseed and one plant of forage radish in a tube filled with potting soil. You see the date. This is mid-November. Okay, these were planted 2 months before. All right, and this is what it looks like from the top. And again, 2 months later, and this is now, you know, we get into November, maybe Thanksgiving, that's about all she wrote on growth. I mean, there might be a few days where stuff is growing, but we can figure maybe December 1 or so, you know, it stopped growing. This is what, you know, the new year on almost New Year's Day, just a day after that, take the skill saw and cut these open. And this is what we've got. We've got roots going down. You see here, 6 foot, so the deepest roots are 6 foot 8 inches down. And what I'm trying to explain is that if you want deep roots, right, you need to provide everything the plant needs to maximize its genetic potential, if that's what you're looking for. So just throwing on the screen now this top technical tips handout, and just highlighting that we've gotten down here to number 7. I'm going to hit on number 8 next. So if we want to optimize our cover crop performance, right? And to do that, we want to, of course, we have to plan and so forth, but we want to have optimum yields. We want to grow a lot of biomass. We have to manage covers like crops. We have to maximize our return on that investment by applying the same, what I'm calling purposeful mindset, right? And attention to detail that we normally reserve for money crops. We want to apply that to cover crops. So the cover crop is not a throwaway afterthought, right? It's part of the planning. And what I suggest is what farmers do, extension agents do, agronomists do, is they say, if you want to optimize growth of a crop, you focus on what we call the law of the minimum, right? So we're continually trying to identify and address what is the limiting factor to yield. And we have this traditional idea often associated with fertility management, Liebig's law of the minimum is sometimes called, with the idea that it's the most limiting factor. Perhaps it's nitrogen, right? If we think of this as staves in a barrel, right? This is a barrel that holds water. The maximum amount of water we can hold is going to be limited by the nitrogen. Now, if we enhance the availability of nitrogen, well, then maybe it's lack of moisture, right? That becomes our next limiting factor. So this concept should be applied to cover crops if you want to optimize them, just like we do with regular crops. So now I want to ask you to think about this. What factors will most likely limit yield of a winter cover crop? You know, in the summer, it's very well understood in most fields in Virginia, on most years, our biggest limiting factor in non-irrigated crop production is not having adequate moisture. But what's our most limiting factor on average? What do you think our biggest obstacle to getting good biomass from a crop that's planted, you know, to be returned to the soil and planted around this time? I'll give you a hint. Okay, these plants, they rely on photosynthetic, they rely on sunlight, they rely on warmth, right? Nothing's happening in the middle of winter. And so if we think of a barrel, right, of different staves that define cover crop growth potential, this right here, low temperature, right, inadequate sunlight, potentially poor seed to soil contact because you know, this is not getting the attention it needs because it's thought of as a throwaway kind of thing. These tend to be the limiting factors, right? So remember, this is extremely important. And one of the points I skipped over is the idea is that cover crop planning and all conservation planning is designed to be done by planners, not robots. So thinking and thoughtful planners are needed because the question of what is the limiting factor for performance on a particular field, that is a site-specific, field-specific question. So it's part of why we need education and we need great people in the field like you guys. All right. Another question I want to ask is, how important can a month, planting a month earlier, how important can that be? You know, I just emphasize in the wintertime, we know nothing grows well in the middle of winter in Virginia. So if we can just squeak it in a month earlier, like we can move this date, let's say from let's say late October to late September, or maybe it's a month earlier, you know, from October 1 to September 1. How important can that be? Let me show you a few examples, okay? Here's another way you can practice or learn about cover crops and actually make some good educational materials. There's some of these cover crop root boxes. They're about 40 inches tall. In this example, I planted this in late September. So I'm calling it early planting, but late September, right? I came back about a month later, and the roots in this box were already at this level, but I just planted these, right? That's when I planted them October 25th. So this one had a month head start. November 7th, this is the contrast in root depth. And when basically, you know, growth is definitely done for the fall, right? I've got roots here at 40 inches down in this box. And, you know, this is where they are on this side. And what I suggest is that the difference in top growth is not as dramatic as the difference in bottom depth, I would suggest to you. And so you got to understand this 1 month earlier planting, it really makes a difference in this case. All right, let's look at another example. Dr. Sarah Hirsch, who's a friend of mine, got her PhD with Dr. Weil at University of Maryland. She's now an extension agent in Maryland. She's just published some absolutely amazing research going down 6 feet to look at nitrogen uptake from cover crops. Here's another example. This is what's the nitrogen uptake, right? Which is one of our key goals in some of our BMPs in Virginia. Planted October 5th. How much nitrogen was taken up? Planted September 2nd. Now, this was maybe on a dairy farm, there was more nitrogen available. But look at the difference. This is the difference that a month can make. You want big radishes? This is the difference roughly a month can make. There's your little radish, plant October 1. This is planted basically September 1, very last of August, right? And this is not just anecdotal pictures. Sarah did some really amazing research where she buried nitrogen at 6 feet, at 4 feet, at 2 feet, and then she compared how well these plants, field planted cover crops, took them up. And this is your early planting results, right? And the thing to focus on is that from the 2 foot depth, the early planting cover crops took up 10 times more nitrogen than the later planted 1 month later. At the 4 foot depth, the nitrogen that was hidden there in the soil or that was placed there, the early planting took up 38 times more. And what's absolutely astounding is that she was able to demonstrate and prove that these roots got down to 6 feet, right, between early September and her December sampling date. So early planting, it just cannot be emphasized enough how important that is. And what I'm showing you is more evidence that Chris's kind of silly drawing, this is real, y'all. These plants will have dramatically different rooting depths than these little ones. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears here and I'm going to move to the second page of this handout. And I'm not sure how far I'm going to be able to get. I'm going to count on my moderators to interrupt me if you know, if we need anything. But you know, I do have about 7 minutes here. So let me see how many of these points I can highlight. You know, I don't want a lot of audience participation today, but this is the one where I was thinking I might ask for some participation. Your best cover crop answer to almost any question about cover crop, it usually starts with the words, it depends, okay? What does it depend on? It depends on the cropping system context, the grower's goals and purposes, the needs of the land, the resource concerns. I've had farmers ask me, and they probably have asked you, what's the best cover crop for soil health? The first thing you say is, it depends. And what's the right rate of rye to put out? What's the right rate of rye? Well, it depends. Okay, from a technical standpoint, every answer to almost every cover crop question usually starts with it depends. After you say it depends, then you turn the question around. You start asking questions about the context, right? The grower's purposes and so forth. So I don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to really make this stick. And so I don't know if everyone I don't know if everyone's allowed to unmute, but I was hoping 100 people could say the two words, "it depends," on cue. When I'm going to say your best cover crop answer usually starts with, and then there's going to be a dramatic pause, and then y'all are going to say, "it depends." So we're going to try this just one time. Okay, you ready? Your best cover crop answer usually starts with,
It depends.
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 it didn't sound like 100 voices, but I heard some very enthusiastic voices. So I'm going to give you full credit. Let's roll on. That, for a lot of you who might be new or maybe not so new, so a farmer answers you this question about cover crops. You're like, oh my gosh, I don't know where to start. The reason you don't know where to start is probably because it does depend. And at least you can say that. And then you turn it around and you start asking questions. Now, what I propose in my tip number 13 is that your first context question is not, what's your purpose? That is something you want to dig out through the conversation. You want to figure that out. But the most important context question for me, working with growers in Virginia, is what's the crop rotation? And then you sketch the answer. Cover crop planning is a form of crop rotation planning. And the easiest way, in my opinion, to frame it up logically is you sketch the rotation, either in your mind, but for people like me, on paper is helpful. And then you identify where are the openings, the gaps in the rotation. And basic cover cropping is finding the cover crops that fit into those existing gaps. Okay. Advanced cover cropping is adjusting the existing gaps to better fit the desired cover crops. But the starting point is, where are the gaps in the cover in the rotation? So this is something that when we get deeper, I can show you. I've got a list here of 31 questions that you should ask or keep in mind when you're planning cover crops about the farmer's overall operation, the field, the soils, what crop is grown before the cover, what crops can be grown after. Very intimidating, but there's one question you should always ask up front, and everything else will flow from that question. If you get into a conversation with the farmer about their crop rotation, and you just keep on asking and keep learning about what they're doing, the other stuff will come. And that is what is the crop rotation and diagramming. So you don't have to use a chart like this. You can just use an old envelope, right? Doesn't matter. It's just a place for you to create a grid, right? To create that diagram. So here is a corn bean rotation, right? This is, the farmer tells you when the crop goes in, roughly when it comes out. He may say, well, I'm not sure exactly. You got to pick something to put on paper. Then you've got a gap, right? You've got a gap. And then you look to, well, what can I use to fill that gap? So what do we fill the gap with? Boy, there's a lot of options, and it can get really confusing, a lot more than it used to. And how do we cut through the cover crop confusion? So this is my tip number 15, making sense of your choices. I'm calling it part 1. So if you've got your tip sheet, this is 15. Know your seasonal niches and functional groups. And this is a categorization system that I came up with that is in a Virginia NRCS manual, cover crop planting manual. We also call it Tech Note 10. And the first version is out there. I've got a draft second version I've been working on for a long time, but this is the foundation of this document. It's this idea of that we'll have 6 seasonal niches that are color coded, and I'll show you that in a moment, and 3 cover crop functional groups, right? And I'll just say you saw 3 functional groups. We can talk more about them another time, right? But generally we have our grasses, like you see here. We have our legumes, which for nitrogen fixing, and we have our non-nitrogen fixing, non-leguminous broadleaves or forbs. And in this case, I've represented some brassicas. Maybe these might be rapeseed. Okay, so those are our 3 functional groups: grasses, legumes, and broadleaf non-legumes, which I divide into brassicas and forbs. We don't have time to talk about all those details, but this is the big picture idea, is that this chart, which you have a hyperlink in the PDF that was sent to you today, that there's a hyperlink in this tip number 15 that takes you to the document online that has this chart in it. And the idea is that it gets back to this idea of sort of diagramming a calendar of the crop rotation, figuring out, well, where are the openings? If we're gonna have a traditional planted in the fall, let it die or kill it in the spring, this is the seasonal niche, right? We plant it sometime in the fall, it overwinters here, and then we kill it in the spring. Now, as we get into fancier cover crop options, we have so many options out there now. Part of that is because there are these other niches that people are trying to sell into, right? So one approach is, for instance, planting something, either a warm season annual or even something like a forage radish. You plant it earlier in the fall and it grows vigorously in the fall, but then it actually will kill either at first frost or when we get into the teens. So the second part of this diagram, once you kind of visualize these seasonal niches, is your choice of species. So there's about 30 different cover crop species that are divided into these categories, right? Functional group times or versus seasonal niche. So if I want a fall seeded winter hardy legume, here are some of my choices, and some of these will be familiar to you. There's not that many choices because these are the ones we know work relatively well. Typically crimson clover, winter peas, Austrian winter peas, and vetch. Yeah, woolly pod is out there versus hairy, but it's pretty much vetch, pea, clover, right? And red clover maybe sometimes. So but this helps you understand where they fit, right? And this has been useful to a lot of people. Now, I'm just about to wrap up here. I'm going to go on another maybe 4 minutes because this is going to take us finally, right, to some of the questions, help us set us up for the question of how do we get more cover crops behind a late harvested cash crop like soybeans. To make sense of your many choices, you also have to think about your planting windows and your species characteristics. Seasonal niche is only a start on understanding if you have a cover crop that actually fit into the window that's available. You got to refine that with your species specific dates. And I have this cover crop planting calendar tool that is useful for that. I'll show you that in a moment. Helps you visualize your planting windows. The other thing, you got to get to know the species. There's about 30 species, let's say, that you can readily buy to plant as cover crops in Virginia. You got to get to know them, okay? And there's no substitute for that, just reading. And if you work for a district and you've got the VACS manual, in your back pocket, there are names of a lot of species there, but it doesn't tell you what they do and what their strengths and weaknesses are. You got to learn that. There's one starting point, it's just a starting point, are the short species descriptions in the Virginia NRCS cover crop manual. So I'll show you, that manual has these elements in it. We got this diagram to sort of help you get organized, figure out, take a first cut and narrowing down your options, right? And in some cases, this one pager is all that you need. Some people don't need more than this, and we can keep it simple for them. But if you want a reminder, let's say on the difference between annual ryegrass and rye, cereal rye, I've got these short descriptions, a starting point. They're limited to about 75 words. Now you need to know a lot more than that, but this is a start. You can go to that SARE book. It's got a whole chapter on rye. It's got a whole chapter on annual ryegrass. The next thing you've got are seeding dates and rates and depths, okay? And this chart, and I'm not going to go through it for long, but these are Virginia NRCS, not DCR. The Virginia NRCS recommended seeding dates. I've got ranges of rates. I've got ranges of depths, and I've got ranges of dates. Why? Because the answer is it depends, right? There's not a single date because cover crops can be used for multiple purposes, but this gives you some, clearly gives you a framework. The problem with this chart is hyper hard to read, right? So I have this Excel spreadsheet tool, which I've also given you a link to how you can get to it. Actually, the version that's out there right now, I've just got on Dr. Wade Thomason's cover crop website, and we'll be putting something maybe in a different place later. But what I want you to understand with this tool is that it helps refine your cover crop seeding windows. You got dates going across the top, right? It all keys off of this average first freeze. So in this particular case, I've got the first freeze date is October 10th. You put that date in there and it just adjusts the dates for you. But what it shows you is that I've got my blues, right? That's my frost winter. That's my fall planted cover crops, right? And the gray ones are the ones that are going to winter kill when we get into the teens. But all of these are my blue category, right? Well, what you notice is the optimum planting window, right? This is the planting window. The optimum is in the dark gray hatch marked, and then the blue represents the full range of planting dates that are recommended, right? So whoops, what's in that graph is the numbers in here, and I don't even look at this anymore because it's just very hard. It's very hard to read this way, but this is a visual representation of it. Okay. So let me just finish up here and just let me give you one example of how you use this information. I'd like a legume behind my soybeans and a head of corn, okay? Here are soybeans, right? Harvested relatively late. What can I plant behind them? Particularly if the function I want, I'm really interested in, is fixing nitrogen ahead of my corn. Well, is there enough of a gap in the rotation here on the front end? I have a gap. On the front end of the gap, is there enough room? How about on the back end? Is there enough room? We'll start by asking about the front end. Well, I don't know if you noticed, this was about the opening I had, right? Late October, early November. That's about when I could get in there and plant with a drill behind those soybeans. And look, I'm in this blue planting window or period. So I'm all good, right? Anything up here should be fair game. Not so fast. We have to refine our choices. So if you go to this planting date calendar where you can do it, a different way and look at the actual dates in the cover crop manual that we've got, put in that average first freeze date. This is for Tappahannock, Virginia, where this case study is, is South, Northeast Virginia. I put that in, and this was the time. This is the time frame I have behind soybeans, right? Well, during this time frame, the only recommended species I have, and I'm at the end of the NRCS recommended planting range, the only species I have to choose from are barley, wheat, triticale, and rye. All these other options, including legumes, I'm outside of that planting window. Now, if I could just plant a month earlier, then I'd have a whole lot more options if I want to come back with a legume. So this is the end of my first part of my presentation. I went over by about 10 minutes. I got started about 10 minutes after 9, so I'm sorry to do this. But what I want to highlight, this is the sticking point, right? And we're going to talk some more when we come back with Bob. We'll talk more about how to get stuff planted. We'll also talk about whether does it make sense to take an airplane or even a ground rig and throw the seed out before the soybeans are harvested. We'll talk about that too. But guys, basic cover crop planning is identifying the gaps and trying to fill them. And the problem with the soybeans, the heart of the question is the gap, right? In the existing rotation, there's not a good gap for putting in cover crops. So it's not going to be easy. That is my pitch. I hope we can take a 10-minute break as planned. I know I need a short biology break, and we can come back to part 2.
Yeah. Hey, Chris, this is Wayne. Let's take 5 minutes, and when we come back, I've got a couple questions that have come in related to your first part of the presentation.
Okay, I'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you.
Okay.
It is 10:07. We'll reconvene at 10:12. Thank you, guys. folks. We'll get started in just another moment. If you've not grabbed that cup of coffee, please do so now. Wayne, whenever you're ready, I've got 10:12.
All right. Chris, are you back?
Maybe we need to wait for Chris.
No, I'm here, just unmuting slowly.
Okay.
Okay. So folks, I just thank you all so much for your patience with me. This is new material or it's not new material, packaged in a new way. And it probably feels like a tidal wave, or perhaps not. So I'm here to try to help. What can I do?
Chris, a couple of questions. One came from a district director, and he's asked, I reckon specifically in Virginia or nearby states, do we have research references showing root depth and root mass for different cover crops under optimal conditions?
There's not as much research as we'd like on that. It is a growing area of interest. Thankfully, there's at least some evidence of the incredible potential properly managed cover crops and cash crops have. But I mean, it's certainly not. I mean, the answer is no. We don't have much for the wide range of cover crops that are available, but there's some.
Okay. All right. The second question, will carbon sequestration possibilities credits have a positive impact on cover crop acreage?
It depends, right? Every cover crop question begins is answered. The answer begins with it depends. So, you know, if I just want to make sure everybody understands the question, right? So I'm trying to share this slide with you. Do you see my graphic, complex graphic again of okay, so just to remember everyone, the idea, okay, is that when we increase organic matter by growing plants, you remember from 5th grade science, carbon dioxide is drawn out of the atmosphere and is locked up in the biomass. And if we do it right, it can also be locked up, at least for a time, in the soil in a way that's very beneficial to agriculture and potentially water quality and many other things. So it's this concept of trying to pull some of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, put it in the ground, is it's a very attractive and a logical component of a carbon, of a climate change mitigation strategy. There was an article I think it was on the front page of the Washington Post about a farmer from Maryland, Bray Hill, talking about how he is currently selling carbon credits to a company. And yes, I mean, he is getting paid something to do the steps. I mean, cover crops will help us sequester carbon. They are not the only way we do it, but they're part of the solution. The question is, will it have a meaningful impact? It depends. It depends on the system that's set up and how it works. But it's really early days on that. So I hope that's helpful.
Yes. All right, at this time, we're going to kind of switch gears and bring in Bob Warren, and we're going to kind of have a tag team approach here. Chris is going to interview, ask Bob some questions, and we hope you all enjoy this next segment. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Chris and Bob.
Did Bob make it back into the meeting?
I'm here.
All right.
Good.
I've been lucky. I haven't gotten kicked out. So,
Oh, good, Bob. We were wondering.
every other DCR employee has.
Yeah, that's what we saw.
Well, Bob, I'm going to keep my slides up here. I see behind you, you've got something that says Brandon Farms. Can you briefly tell us about the agricultural operation, the scale and size and crops you grow.
We're corn and soybeans, full season beans, been without small grains for 8 or 9 years. Cover crops is basically our third crop. We're somewhere between 400 and 500 acres. We have tried and experimented with all kinds of cover crops. Most probably what everybody has experimented with, but looking at niche type situations, had a lot of research on the farm through Virginia Tech and the district and NRCS. So just trying new things and trying to see where we need to be in the next 5 years for sustainability. I think that's our biggest issue right now.
So let me ask you, since you brought up you have some cover crop experience, when you put it in a nutshell, how many years of cover crop experience do you have, would you say?
25-ish, 15 certainly with DCR, 16 with DCR, and then I was working in fertilizer industry for 10 years, and we were selling cover crops at the time and working with farmers.
Right.
So,
but in terms of using them at Brandon Farms,
I'd say 10 consistent years.
So, one of the things I advise these guys to do is when you start talking about cover crops that you ask, what's the crop rotation? And you and I have talked about this before. And so let's jump into that. So I'm putting up a diagram here that I think should represent your rotation in terms of cash crops.
Yeah.
And you did say something, we haven't grown small grains for a while. So maybe we could talk about the money crops that you grow, and sell are limited to corn and soybeans, correct?
Correct.
And I'll just ask, it sounds like you used to grow small grains, you used to grow a winter crop for production or for cash crop. Why do you not grow that anymore?
We just made a decision when we started looking at cover crops. We just made a decision that it was better for us and our operation to focus on that aspect and not look at a wheat or a barley as a cash crop, but use it as a cover crop instead. We and focus our efforts on growing more soybeans. Instead of trying to grow 2 crops, focus our efforts on maybe the single crop and see if we can get a better soybean crop instead of a mediocre soybean crop.
So, and you're referring to 2 crops being the small grains. It's usually followed by double crop soybeans, and you're compromising some of your soybean yield potential typically because you're growing small grains in or wheat. I'll just, the wheat would be here in the rotation, everybody. That's where the cursor is. The wheat would fill in here, right, as cash crop wheat, and it would actually go all the way to here. So you'd have to, you'd have a shorter summer for your soybeans. But what I'd like to highlight to everyone, this is a big picture idea. I know there's some directors out there, some maybe bigger picture folks. Guys, you got to remember, everyone specializes, right? And and so what farmers have to do to be very efficient is, and this is the nature of the market we've given them to sell into, is that they have to be very efficient. So what I'm hearing Bob say is he and his dad are like, we got to be better at growing corn and soybeans. They have off-farm activities as well. So, and Bob, you're going to correct me if I'm wrong, but the point is they're saying we don't want to grow 3 different crops for production because it takes a whole pile of other equipment that we have to own and maintain and all that. So we're going to just be corn and soybean farmers, the best we can be at that. But what that does is that it leaves this gap in the rotation where small grains used to fulfill some of that keeping the soil covered function. You now have to plant something else if you want to get all those keep the soil covered benefits, because the small grain for production is not there anymore, and it used to provide some of that. Bob, did I miss anything there?
No, that's good. And one of the other options, I mean, one of the other things that why we backed off of wheat is because of some sort of what we're facing now with wheat in the field that's waterlogged and so forth. And so that was just one of the other factors. We thought it was better to focus on 2 good crops instead of trying to grow 3 maybe mediocre crops. So
right. and price gets into it, right? And
Sure.
like you said, very important that, you
Yeah.
know, you have too much moisture in some of your fields for good, reliable wheat production. And so, you know, for the newer planters out there, you have to understand this when you're talking to farmers. How do you learn it? You have to talk to them. Just talk to them. And you know, what you're doing is you're asking the context questions. But you know, when we talk about the Brandon Farms, we don't talk about it solely in terms of cover crops. Talk about the human aspect. I mean, you know, we talk about what is Bob's day like and where does he sell his grain to and how it all fits together. And then you are able to better help him navigate just the cover crop part because you understand him. So let's look at these dates if you're ready for that, Bob.
Yep.
This is I know you're looking to change this, so we're going to call this your standard or your original rotation. Roughly mid-April, you'd come in and plant corn for grain, and then a relatively shorter season corn, and you typically get it out. You know, it might be a little aggressive here, but
No,
you know, by early September, very early September, you're ready. If you want to come back and plant something, you're ready.
yeah, that's about what we were doing. Yes. Last week of August, we were heavy in the corn.
Right. And so a lot of us would say, ooh, you got a big window here to plant some stuff. That's great. Okay, but then let's look at the soybeans. So typically you come back and your soybeans would go in like 20th of May. And then I think you said, you know, of course, soybeans have maturity groups, right? And you can you can select your maturity group. The maturity group you were looking at, I think it might have been a 4 or 5.
Late 4, early 5 is what we
Right.
have been planting in the past.
And, you know, again, for those who are out there who don't know what that means, that's not a big deal. It gets back to, it comes out about mid-October. So here are the windows that we have, right? And look at the title, everyone. It's find a cover crop to fit the existing gaps. That is basic cover crop planning, I should say. We're going to figure out what fits. So what, you know, I guess I have 2 questions for you. You got to, you know, you have about 10 years of experience. I'm just rounding, right? But you have 10 years of experience, Bob, with this rotation, filling the gaps with cover crops. And so maybe we can talk about, you know, what cover crops you found to work there, and what were you trying to accomplish with them? What were your purposes?
Behind corn.
Okay, behind corn.
For whatever reason, there are certain cover crops that you like, certain cover crops you don't like. I liked radishes. I've always liked them. We've put in a lot of rye, and we've also put in a lot of wheat. We've planted clover, etc. So behind that corn was a great window for radishes and a legume and a clover. So a multi-species type mix because it would grow well. We had very good success with the radishes and the rye growing off, and then the clover in the spring.
So you would grow radishes and clover, and you had this great time slot for doing it. So then you come back and, you know, when would you typically terminate that cover crop ahead of the soybeans?
Well, normally we plant, typically we plant green, plant beans green. I will say that we did try 2 or 3 years ago. We did try some annual ryegrass, and I got scared, so we killed it early when we know we could kill it. That's about the only time we've really killed it early. For the most part, I think we've transitioned to planting green since then on both corn and beans. So
when you say planting green, I'm going to tell you what it means to me, and you tell me if I'm right. Is the idea, of course, you're a no-tiller, and I should have highlighted that before, but you guys you probably don't even have any tillage
30
equipment.
years, 30 plus years. Yes.
So that's part of the carbon sequestration that's happening on your farm. Okay. And carbon sequestration, guys, is not just about growing cover crops. It's about a system where the soil disturbance is minimized. That's the science of soil carbon. We got to keep things from, keep the soil undisturbed as much as possible. So the idea here is that instead of using an herbicide to kill the cover crop 2 weeks ahead, you would actually spray it potentially just before planting or even after planting. You're just going to roll into that green material with your planter and just plant through it. And that's what we're talking about, planting green. Does that sound right?
Sounds right. But we would actually put our chemicals on after we plant. And that was the other, our burn down and our residual chemicals went on after we planted. That's why we went with that way.
And so, he's referring there to residual chemicals, again, weed control, not doing any tillage of any kind, and very environmentally, beneficial, but we do have to minimize weed competition. So using some herbicides, I'll circle here, use some herbicides to kill this crop, this existing crop, and using some herbicides to deal with weeds, that may come. And we'll talk more about that. But the interesting thing you said is that, this was your opportunity to even try some legumes with fixed nitrogen. But the crop to follow is soybeans. I mean, this is a crop you don't fertilize with nitrogen. So let's go to this after the soybeans, which come out late October or mid-October in this system. When do you get in and plant there? And what were you planting?
We've been involved with cost share, whether it's through NRCS or the district, for some years now. And so that date, that early planting date, has always been forefront to us. And so normally after soybeans, we would go with a rye or a wheat. We weren't focused on a legume prior to corn, so that wasn't a concern at the time. So it was more of trying to get something established. So more in the realm of rye, and then we've transitioned to wheat here recently because of a whole host of issues as far as availability and cost and what have you. But
so this is the grass cover crop, and you forgive my kindergarten drawing skills here, but this is a grass cover crop, and it sounds like you're telling the folks that I was right when I showed this example, that when you get into this planting window, at least the NRCS recommendations for, are that pretty much your grasses, your small grains, which is a subset of grasses, your rye, maybe your wheat, your triticale, but especially your rye. I mean, there's your best bet. But let's say, what purpose would you say you were growing this rye, or I'll use the term rye, but the small grains here after soybeans? What were you getting out of it? What was the purpose it was fulfilling?
in front of corn,
Yeah.
it was more trying to pull nitrogen or hold nitrogen and keeping something green on that field. That was scavenging and erosion. That was our main focus in the beginning.
And so I'm just going to go to this slide here just to help people understand that, this is what the crop, I don't know if this is the crop we're talking about. This is what it looked like, right? And I'm not sure he would let it get to this height, but this is what it looked like. And some of the key functions it fulfills are this idea of sucking up nitrogen, right? And then just providing cover, reducing erosion, and so forth. But when you look at this diagram, I mean, what other function would you like to have ahead of corn that you were not getting?
Right now?
No, I mean back in that system. Now, yeah, I mean, going back to this, I mean, you're spending a lot of money and you're concerned about adequate nitrogen, providing adequate nitrogen to corn, and you're not getting any nitrogen fixation. You're just sucking nitrogen up out of the ground if there is any, and that nitrogen may not cycle back very well to the corn crop.
And in all actuality, because of our program, we're actually applying some nitrogen at planting, and then we're side dressing twice We're alleviating any concerns of tie-up, nitrogen tie-up from that rye.
So, but I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, are you interested in getting different purposes out of this cover crop ahead of corn, as you've gone along?
At the time, at the point we're planting corn, it's not 5 and 6 feet tall, so we're not looking for weed control at that point. It was more that rye and wheat was more a winter type of scenario for us. We weren't looking at contributing much to that next cash crop.
So that and forgive me because I got a little off track there, but you're doing a good job staying on track. This shows the cover crop system that you had to fill the existing gaps, where the green indicates some legumes and brassicas, and you probably also had some small grain mixed in there, but that was ahead of soybeans. And then your small grain cover crop, driven in large part by your planting date restriction, if you will, that was driven by, that's what was ahead of corn. Bob, is it okay if I ask you about the idea of overseeding and how you plant in this time frame, and why you don't spin? Why don't you just throw the seed out earlier, and that would give you an earlier planting window? Is that okay if we dig into that at this point?
Yeah, that's actually a good place to put it in. I'm speaking about my farm. I'm not a big fan of broadcasting seed. I think it is imperative. We drill all of our cover crop. We have small seed attachment on the back of the drill for the radish, rapeseed, clover, what have you. And then we have the main box for our grasses. And I have actually broadcast seed and come back a month later and drilled into the same field, and that drilled cover crop outperformed the broadcasted seed. I'm not saying it won't work. I just think on a consistent basis for us and our soils and our fields, drilling and getting that seed to soil contact or some form of incorporation, whether it's broadcasting and incorporation or drilling, I think for us exceeds just broadcasting and letting the leaves drop and cover the seed. That's just a personal experience.
So let me review what you said, and then I might bring up the tips sheet that I shared earlier. You normally plant after the preceding crop is harvested. You use a drill, a grain drill, to put the seed into the soil. And we talk about seeding depth, and whether it's a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch. I'm not sure that's what's as important as the fact that you make sure the seed is in the soil and not sitting on top of the ground. Is that what you're saying when you drill it?
Correct. And we're not so much worried. We actually plant a little bit lighter. We plant a little bit. We don't go as deep as most might on a grain crop, because I'm looking for that heat. When we get colder into the season behind soybeans, I'm looking for the heat from the sun to warm that top inch or so of soil. And so I'll put it in a little bit lighter than I normally would for a grain crop.
But the number one thing is that you're waiting until the crop is out of the field because you feel like you can do it better,
Yes,
do it right.
I do.
And so on this diagram, I'm trying to represent that. Yeah, I mean, in theory, you could use an airplane, or you could use a ground rig to spin the seed out and let the leaves of the soybeans fall on top of the seed, so the seed would be on the surface of the ground, and you could do it earlier. Forgive me if you mentioned this, but do you have any direct experience doing that?
I mean, I did. Yes, I've done that. I've spread I've run a broadcast rig through standing soybeans prior to yellowing or just at yellowing. And I tried it, and the stand was so bad that I actually drilled into half the field I drilled into that same field a month later after we had harvested the soybeans, and that drilled outperformed the broadcast by a tremendous amount. And that sold me for our farm that we needed seed to soil contact. And so personally, that's what I've done or am doing.
So the concept, and you tell me if I'm right, Bob, is that when seeds need water and seeds need to be moist in order to germinate. And there's a lot of moisture, even a soil that feels kind of dry. There's a fair amount of moisture in there that can get a seed going. But when a seed is sitting on the surface of the soil, there's a lot more risk. I mean, of course, if you get a perfect rain, right after you spin it out there, then good things can happen. But your probability of success is lower if you don't put the seed in the soil and get what we call seed to soil contact. And so I have one of my mentors who's a farmer, in Eastern Virginia. He has a rule of thumb that, it's just a rule of thumb, but a lot of times if you broadcast it, it's you get the same performance as if you waited 2 weeks and drilled it. You know what I'm saying? So the idea is it's going to kind of sit around for a while, a lot of years, not every year, but a lot of years is going to sit around for a while before it really gets going. So you kind of can wait 2 weeks and drill it, or you can broadcast it without incorporation today. What do you think of that kind of generalization?
I agree with that. And I'm not even so sure that you would get I wouldn't get the same stand broadcasting as I would if I waited 2 or 3 weeks and drilled it. I think I have a better chance of getting a better complete stand with a drilled rig.
So,
not that there's not places for broadcasting, but in my experience, I've gotten better results out of drilling it.
So I think the important point to emphasize to everyone listening, is that we are not saying that broadcasting without incorporation over top of a standing crop, we're not saying it can't work. And it does work, it does work well for some folks, but we are breaking, if you will, a basic rule of agronomy. If we're managing covers like crops, remember that idea. If we want to maximize, the return on investment, and I would say not just the farmer's investment, but probably the taxpayer's investment, ideally, we'd like to put the seed into the soil. I'm not going to argue whether it should be an inch or a half an inch, but a rye seed put into the soil, as opposed to sitting potentially even on top of a piece of residue. So you can meet the seeding date by spinning it out early, but it's not the same as seeding it properly early. And that's,
it's all in what you want out of that cover crop.
right. It's all what you want. And let's talk about, what do you want out of a cover crop in terms of, your level of management at this point in your cover cropping career. I'll put it this way. I said that if you want to do it right, you should apply the same mindset to cover crops that you apply to your cash crops. What do you think of that?
I agree. And I've, I was in the same mindset 6-8 years ago of not treating cover crop as one of our crops. And I actually told Dad this past year, I said, we need to start looking at cover crops and managing these cover crops with the same intensity that we manage corn or soybeans. And, we've gotten to the stage that we're side dressing corn twice, as a lot of folks are around here. And that's intensive management, if you ask me. And we need to start managing these cover crops. And I see weeds becoming a problem for us personally on our farm. And I see heat and water management as 2 big concerns as we move in the next 5 years. And so that's why Dad and I are looking to manage these crops and get what we can out of them, so that we're mitigating our problems coming from the heat stress and water retention.
So Bob, I put up, you should see on your screen now,
I see it.
a list of purposes, and this is where I wanted you to go. You already started down this road. Here's a picture of some cover crops planted into a roll down rye. Let me just reiterate back to you what I heard you say is that what's shown in this image right here, this is kind of where you're headed. You know, it's not just stop erosion and suck up some nitrogen anymore. You tell us more about this idea of suppressing weeds, that goal.
We- So
And
we're
why is it important to you?
we're finding ourselves, and I've done a lot of research, I've done a lot of reading, and I don't know that we have any new chemistry coming out in that will be available in my farming career that's left. That's kind of the way I understand. And so we're finding resistant weeds to a whole host of chemicals, whether the main one being Roundup, but a whole host of chemicals that are we have now are trying to use. These weeds are becoming resistant to them, and so we've got to somehow figure out on our farm how to keep them from germinating to a degree that it doesn't inhibit our crop. And I'll say 2 years ago, last year, we had so many mare's tail in our field that were Roundup resistant that you could not see the soybeans, and got into the corn and were able to control them some in corn, and that's through rotation. But you know, that's just creating a whole host of other issues when you've got that many seeds, seed heads produced.
So, you know, just for everyone to understand, I mean, this is an issue that you know is highlighted, picked up occasionally in your general newspapers. You know, I mean, the New York Times or whatever, Wall Street Journal of the world. I mean, it's understood that herbicide-resistant weeds are becoming a major threat to agriculture, and it's also to no-till agriculture. But you know, what we have in Virginia is a weed scientist at Virginia Tech, Dr. Mike Flessner. He has researched this, and he has numbers that show that you can get dramatic reduction in some of the weeds you're talking about with the cover crop. And you know, and I think it's worth going back to this image that weeds are suppressed both during the crop growth phase, right, and afterwards. So it's a system that the cover crop greatly enhances, right, is we're competing against weeds with either dead residue or living plants. You also mentioned this managing temperature, and you know, I don't want to dwell on this too long, but you know, it goes back to the same mat of residue fulfilling that second function, right?
Yes. And I'm not there yet, but that's my goal, because I think I truly think it is that important in the next 5 years.
The other thing that we talked about a little bit is that because of the rotation setup that you have, you were pretty much forced to grow small grain ahead of corn. And you'd kind of like to have the small grain, like we see over here, kind of like to have that ahead of soybeans. So it's kind of like you didn't have the opportunity to put the right cover crops, if you will, the ideal cover crops ahead of the right crops. And so, you know, that takes us back to this diagram. So what I propose to do is I'm gonna try to erase some of this, and then let's talk about, we're running out of time. This is a perfect segue to talk about your new rotation. Whoops, I kind of lost my place. I think this is where we're ready to go here.
Yeah, there you go.
So you told me that you have a plan to not just fill the gaps, but change the gaps, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And what I'm going to highlight here, we're focused on the soybeans for the moment, is that you're going to plant soybeans a little earlier in the spring. That's the plan. You're going to change the maturity group, and they're going to come out basically half a month earlier. And you're going to open up the gap a little bit on this end. Is that right?
That's what I hope. Yes.
That's the idea.
That's the idea.
And then the second part of that is that you're shifting your corn. The idea is that corn is going to go in a little later, and it'll come out a little later. But what it does, if it's very simplistic, but can you confirm that essentially if we can get 2 weeks on either end, that's a month of additional photosynthetic potential at the best time, right? It's not like we're getting an extra month in December. When you get an extra month, at the very beginning and the end of the cover crop cycle, we have the opportunity to, just grow a much better cover crop. And that will give you an opportunity to put in some legumes ahead of corn.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
that's right. And I've watched the plots from the district and NRCS here, and I've seen some good results. And so I haven't. We're trying a little bit of vetch this year, and I've seen what they've done, and so I wanted to try and see if we could work in that direction. So that's why we're starting to change part of that soybean rotation.
So the idea here is you're opening up a gap, right? And there are some farmers who will try to overcome this, this problem right here, this later plant. Some do broadcast seed. And it's funny, you and I were talking about a farmer who's having a lot of success, but he is buying coated seed, actually seed that has clay on it. And it's funny because we say we need seed to soil contact. His soil is in the bag. Like there's a little coating of soil on the seed, and that helps hold moisture against the seed. That's the idea, right? It's all about this basic idea. The seed needs to imbibe water to get started, and we can't let it dry out once that process starts, because then we've got trouble. So that's one change. But you're also going to narrow up this window a little bit. Right? You're changing the window ahead of soybeans. So what are you going to plant ahead of soybeans? What's your focus there?
Mainly in looking at that, trying to move towards that mat or that weed control, the heat stress control and moisture retention. We're moving towards a grass. A grass and maybe vetch. I've looked at planting a little bit of vetch and some rye ahead of soybeans. I've seen some research out of Australia that actually vetch will help soybean yield, and so something I want to try. But
and you should talk to Paul Davis about that. I don't think he's a big fan of vetch ahead of soybeans because he had an experience, but it's not research based.
right.
I will just say that I don't know. It may not be quite apparent in the color coding, but this is your old system where, excuse me, the blue, right? The small grain, you had it it was mostly a small grain ahead of corn. And what you're doing here, you can see we're flip-flopping it, right? That's the idea, is to get better, to maximize the return on the cover crop. He's changing the rotation. It doesn't seem like much, but remember what we said about a month of photosynthesis at the right time of year, assuming it rains some during that month, can mean a huge amount to the impact and of the cover crop. So, we're about out of time, but I want to, and we haven't fielded any questions yet, but the question was asked, how do we get more cover crops behind soybeans? And my first answer, it's not going to be easy, because look at all the time you've spent and you're just trying to change your rotation, right?
Yeah.
Would you agree? It's not necessarily easy.
No, it's not. But it's where I think we need to be on Brandon Farms for sustainability. I really do, with the weather and the issues with weeds that we have coming. I think it's what we have to do. I really do.
And you're not saying this is what we have to do for the bay, and you're not saying it to meet cost share deadlines. You're saying it for your production. And so, the question that we got implies that there's someone out there who wants to see it who agrees with you. They want more cover crops behind soybeans, and for another reason. So, but I'm going to say that there needs to be an understanding. I'll try this out on you and Wayne, and we can maybe open it up to some questions. How can districts get more cover crops behind soybeans? You're going to have to understand their farmers' systems and help promote systems level thinking, because yes, it's possible that seed coatings can ensure better success. Yes, it's possible that broadcasting will work, but there's also the issue of just the capacity. Even if the field is open, how do you get a huge amount of cover crop seed out, in a short time, right? It's all a race against time. So we're gonna have to understand our farmers' systems better, because we picked the low-hanging fruit, right? Bob, what do you think about that?
I 100% agree with that. I think that as conservation specialists, and that's what we all are with these agencies. I truly think we need to spend more time on the farm selling the product. I think that that instead of staying, and I'm sorry if this sounds this way, but I think instead of staying in the office, we need to be calling the farmer and saying, are you out today in the field? Are you planting? Can I come ride with you? Can I come talk to you? Just see what you're doing. And I think that would mean a whole lot to the farmer. I have seed dealers come down the driveway and fertilizer dealers, but very rarely do you see a conservation specialist come down the driveway. And I think that it's just as important to talk and learn. And that's how I learn. When people come out and talk and look, that's how I learn, to be honest.
So we've covered a lot of ground and we're already at 11. And I apologize, Bob, because I ate into some of your time because I went long on my first hour. But I'm going to suggest we pause there. I'm sorry for the kindergarten drawing on the screen in front of you, but I'm going to leave it and just see what Wayne wants to, and Kendall want to do next.
Ready? Hey, Bob, got a question that came in from the field. Can you share what motivated Brandon Farms to change your planting dates, soybean groups? The person's indicated this, as you know, it's a tough thing to change and move these planting dates. And sometimes a farmer, realizing the benefit of those 2 to 4 weeks, changes in a rotation. I know you shared some of your concerns about weed suppression. Could you just elaborate a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it is hard, and it's hard to change your mindset, and that's why I think that last year we're moving to an earlier soybean. I thought there would be repercussions from doing that, and in fact, it turned out that it was the other way around. We used to grow a late 4, early 5 soybean, and now we're moving to all early 4s and even trying some late group 3s this year, which would buy us a lot of time in the fall putting in cover crops. But I thought we would see a tremendous yield lag, and we did not. Last year, we saw actually an increase. Our early group 4 soybeans actually out yielded our early group 5s. And I understand from talking to industry that's not uncommon. And what does concern me, and why we're taking it small and kind of moving from year to year and trying a few things, is that these weather patterns are starting to make me think a little bit, and trying to figure out how can I mitigate my problems when we're in the heat of July and August. And I've watched what Rob Hinton is doing over there with rolling rye, and I went down with him to North Carolina, and to see that mat underneath soybeans, and to put your hand underneath that mat and feel the temperature and feel the moisture would relieve, in my opinion, a lot of stress. And we believe, I think Dad and I are beginning to believe in this so much that we're actually looking at upgrading planters next year to the point that we're going to be able to roll or crimp on the go. And that's not a small investment. And it's holding your nose and going, and you got to figure it out. I think that's where we're headed. But I do think climate is a major factor for Dad and I.
All right,
Did I just add something real quick?
sure.
You know, something that I've started telling people is that, you know, you have a grower who maybe manages 1,000 acres, maybe 5,000 acres. Bob's talked about starting small. We don't have to propose to change the whole operation. Just, you know, take one problem field that has a lot of weeds, you know, a real problem field that might represent 1% of your operation, right? So on a 5,000 acre operation, what is 1%? I think that's 50 acres. Just take that and try there, right? Start small. Don't be afraid to fall. That's one of the tips in this sheet. But I think sometimes we get this idea that, well, oh, they wouldn't do that. That's too much of a change. Just do it on 1 to 5% of the acreage, and that's how we will incrementally move the needle. But if we keep thinking we have to do it all at once, you're never going to get anywhere.
Chris, this is Wayne. Another question. The first edition of Tech Note 10 in the Field Operation Technical Guide, where can we find the most recent one, edition 3?
You said edition 3. In the Field Office Technical Guide, it's still that version 1.0, and it has the tables that I showed you.
Mm-hmm.
The easiest way to get to it in the tips that I gave you on the handout, I mean, finding your way through the FOTG is a little problematic. So I gave you a direct link to that document in tips 15 and 16. Does that make sense? There's a hyperlink to that.
Yes.
Chris, that's perfect. For folks who hadn't gotten that handout and registered after 8 a.m., we'll be sending it to all participants after the call today.
All right.
10:59, Wayne. Do you want to slip another question in?
Yeah. This question could be for Chris or Bob, or maybe even one of our meeting participants. What impact has cover crop acreage assisted Virginia in meeting its water quality goals? And I think the mindset behind this question is often we're looking for selling points when we're meeting with a farmer, he or she, to why to put in cover crops. And there's a lot of data that goes in that districts are putting in the VACS program. But on the back end, they hear very little about what impact it's having. Could somebody comment to this point in time in meeting the 2025 WIP goals? What value and part are cover crops playing in Virginia?
That may be addressed. That might be a good question for David Bryan in his presentation.
All right.
Yeah, we'll probably touch on that, but just to, real quickly, I mean, it's huge. I mean, the SL8B specifically, and our signups have a major role in addressing our WIP 3 goals in the next 5 years. The only issue is that, of course, with cover crops, we report on an annual basis. So every year the numbers change, as opposed to, like some of our other most critical practices like the SL6s for stream exclusion. Those usually have, 10 or 15 year lifespan. So once you report it, you're getting credit for the next decade or more. The cover crops, again, every single year you're having to report, and in years where there's, bad weather, so ton of rain, whatever the case may be, it certainly can hurt us too.
Do you want to go a little break or go right into it?
I think go ahead and do like a 5-minute break again.
All right, hey, David, I think what we're going to do at this time, maybe take, what time you want them back? We're going to take a 5-minute break.
11:07.
11:07, we'll start with you, David, and you can start on some of the, your presentation. And, but give everybody a chance to hit the restroom or get some coffee or whatever. So again, we'll start back at 11:07.
Sounds good.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Making sure he can share.
That's what I'm going to try right now.
I know. Maura's got your slides ready to go if needed, but I can see your presentation. There
That's
you
a miracle.
go. Hey, and surprising, it doesn't cut off this time.
Oh, good. Well, even better. Sounds good.
Perfect. Take a breather, get another cup of coffee. You've got still a good 4 minutes or so.
Appreciate it.
Hey, David,
Yeah.
I just sent you a text. Is there some way for you to turn up your mic?
Well, I got a headset on that's right beside my mouth.
Sounds like you're in the next room.
You are less than Bob and other speakers. I turned up the volume on my own computer because of it.
Let me try to disconnect the headset and try my just my computer. 1 second.
That's better.
That's better.
Does this sound better?
Yep.
Yeah. Much better.
Okay, this is just the morning full of surprises. All right, sounds good.
There's a trash can probably by your desk.
All right, well, we're good.
Worth it for that anyway. Thank you.
Is Chris Lawrence still on here?
Yeah, I'm here.
I just have to say, I think for the rest of the participants that are on here, that your wife must be one special woman. You're on top of the roof planting cover crops. I'd be long gone.
I do love that.
So, yeah, she's stuck with me a long time now. So, but it's funny, you know, I have another set. Like because of course I had to cut those 10-foot PVC pipes in to get the cover crop out, but I have another set ready to go. I haven't found the energy to put them up and do another round, but I can give them to you, Bob, if you want to try them.
You know, the image I had in my head was National Lampoon's Christmas Christmas with you on the roof planting cover crops.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
This is Mark Holberg. Did you get up on the roof and water those or do anything, or was that just natural rainfall?
No, I mean, I wanted to I didn't want them to lack for anything. And so I did get up there and water them. And, you know, what's interesting about it is that people would say, well, you know, if a crop doesn't lack for anything, it has no reason to grow roots. Well, I mean, my experience there helps us, you know, highlight that it wasn't really lacking for anything, but it still put roots down, you know, 6.5 feet.
Very impressive.
Mm-hmm.
But the most important thing is that we actually have, there is research to support that happens in the field as well. So.
Close.
Folks, we're gonna start in just a minute. Grab that cup of coffee and head on back. I'm gonna toss it over to Wayne Davis to get us started.
All right, thank you, Kendall. All right, we're going to move right in to our next speaker, David Bryan. And David's going to provide us some discussion about some of the VACS practices, especially those that relate to cover crop. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to David.
Well, thanks, Wayne. Thanks, Kendall. I appreciate y'all hosting this. As Bob mentioned earlier, a bunch of us DCR folks have been having network issues popping in and out this morning. So I didn't get to hear as much of Chris's as I'd like to, but I'm on a personal computer now and it seems to be going a lot better. So we'll just go with it. I had to convert this presentation on the quick to Google Slides. This is the first time I've ever given a Google slideshow, but hopefully it works just as well as PowerPoint, and we'll just go with it. Anyway, again, thank you all for having me. It's hard to follow up on Bob and Chris. Obviously, a lot of what I've learned in my shorter career has been from Chris in terms of in the cover crop world. So I appreciate everything y'all done, and I enjoyed listening to your conversation. I was asked in my time this morning to really give a review of cover crops in the VACS program with specific emphasis on SL8B, which was mentioned earlier. And I put in my title in the PY22 VACS program. There are going to be a few changes to some of our cover crop practices starting July 1st. And I really didn't want to train on current material that's soon going to become outdated. So I'll let you know when there's things that I talk about that will be new as of July 1st in the new state fiscal year. All right, so again, we're trying to get into the key VACS cover crop options, but we are going to spend a majority of our time on SL8B, going through, why do we use this practice? What is it for? Considerations when, working with producers on this practice, planting dates, cover requirements, and then just some tips. I think Wayne asked me to cover this just on VACS signups in general as relates to cover crops and district board options for cover crop planting dates for extreme acts of nature. So with that said, we're just going to give a brief intro. We are not going to try to get into every single cover crop that VACS offers this morning, except for just a very light overview, enough to, give you some background, maybe some refresher for those who use these, and for those who don't, at least introduce you to the options that are out there. So these are the big five that we're going to be talking about. SL8B is our small grain and mixed cover crop for nutrient management and residue management. Super long title. Most of us just call it the SL8B. It is the go-to option in Virginia. Far more SL8B acres get enrolled into contracts than any other practice in Eastern Virginia. WQ4 is our legume paste cover crop. SL8H is our harvestable cover crop. SL8 is a specialty crops practice. And then SL8A is sort of, it's new, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in depth later. It's sort of a catch-all for everything else. So with that said, we're going to just get into it. Instead of, repeating myself over and over, first of all, I want to, again, thank Chris for his sheet of 20 technical tips. There's a lot in there that applies, to all of our practices. There are some times, we all know, when, some things that NRCS can do that we can't, and on the DCR side and vice versa. However, a lot of on the technical side of this, the conversation's about the same. We need to be planners and not robots. We need to be working hand in hand with the producer to find ways and the best fit to establish vegetative cover on cropland, reduce erosion and loss of nutrients. VACS, obviously, as many of y'all know, is a water quality program. We are geared toward water quality as opposed to other resource concerns, but obviously we impact many other resource issues. All of our cover crops are annual practices where a farmer can sign up each and every year. It may not make sense to do that, and that's up to the conservation planner working with the farmer, but they are eligible to do so. Participants have the option of selecting cost share or tax credits for their cover crop work, but not both. Most of our practices, or all of our cover crop practices, have seeding types and rates and planting dates prescribed in the manual. But again, be planners, not robots. Nutrient management plans are required. An NMP is essentially the gateway to a lot of our cropland practices in VACS. So whether that be a private planner done with no cost share, a private plan, or whether it be, say, one of our on-staff planners doing that plan, or the participant signs up for NM1A and works with a private planner, whatever the case may be, they have to have a fully implemented nutrient management plan as the gateway to get involved with these practices. I was asked to emphasize no nutrients are allowed at planting of any of our cover crops at this point. And that is across the board. It's a question that comes up, but again, no nutrients allowed. And they require multiple field checks. So generally, district staff have to get out in the field to check cover to make sure that we've reached 60%, excuse me, 60% cover, as well as at the end of the season, make sure it was maintained. All right, so those were some commonalities between some of our practices, but I want to get a little bit more in detail, just a slide each on some of these. So WQ4 is where we're going to start today. It's our legume-based cover crop. Obviously, as a legume, we're utilizing it as a natural source of nitrogen to reduce applied soil amendments. This is a $30 per acre practice. And the key is that unlike some of our other practices, this is meant to stay on the field at the very end, when it's whether intact and unincorporated. It cannot be incorporated. It needs to be there as a mulch, so to speak, so that when the farmer goes in and plants the commodity crop after it, again, they're going right over and in it. All right. So then to our SL8H, this definitely is not allowed on the NRCS side, but it is on the DCR side, is our harvestable cover crop. This is an option for folks who know that at the end of the season, at the end of the winter season and going into the spring, that they're going to need extra, hay, silage, grain, whatever. Under this practice, we still require 60% cover. We have planting dates and so forth that must be met, but they can harvest it after March 14th, whether that be for hay, haylage, silage, grain, whatever. It may be incorporated or left unincorporated on the field at the producer's choice. We do allow manure use on up to 300 acres, but there's certain conditions that are listed in the manual. I'm not going to get into those weeds today. And this is a $20 per acre payment for this practice. It's one of our lower paying practices for obvious reasons. We want people to go with some of our other options like the WQ4 and SL8B, but in some cases, 8H is what fits with the producer's long-term plans. Okay, SL8. This is our, this has been around for a while. It's our specialty crop practice, specialty crop cover crops. It's used a lot, most specifically for vegetable and tobacco farmers. Actually, our technical advisory committee this past, I guess it was 2 years ago now, looked at redoing this spec, and in the end, they decided to create a new spec, which we're going to talk about, the SL8A. So this stayed largely the same because folks are already using it and working with tobacco producers specifically. Seeding needs to be planted and certified by November 30th. It has to be on the ground for 90 days after certification. It can be incorporated or left unincorporated. Again, the farmer's choice. But again, hopefully y'all can, as you're working in the field with the producer, you can give some advice on what would fit best for their operation. And then a flat rate per acre payment of $30 per acre. Okay, so those I wanted to get through fairly fast, just as hitting the highlights. But SL8A, we're going to spend a little bit more time on because it is new, and then hit the big one last. All right, so this is new as of this program year. SL8A was really created because there's a variety of unusual situations that were brought to the TAC. For example, summer cover crops, I'm going to hit on that in a little bit. VACS traditionally has not had a good summer cover crop option, but as they grow in popularity, it is something we wanted to make available. We also don't have anything, or previous to this, didn't have any cover crops where, if a storm came, for example, or some other unforeseen circumstance, a crop failure, and we're trying to keep cover on that land, keep the soil covered for as much time as possible. We didn't have anything to really fill the gap. So that was an interest of DCR and partners to be able to fill those gaps. And Bob, if you have anything you want to jump in and say on any of this, let us know. Bob was the chair of the cover crop nutrient management subcommittee that worked on this spec, so I appreciate his work and the others that worked on it. SL8A incentivizes producers to keep cover on cropland simply when it's not in use. And again, we're sort of calling it our catch-all cover crop. It really is for all those other circumstances that haven't been caught by the other practices. So this could be, again, after a crop failure, a flood, tornado, hurricane damage, or it could be planned ahead well in advance in the case of a summer cover crop. So again, it's a good tool in the toolbox. It is, how do I say, it's probably is less rigid and more flexible than some of our other options. So again, those who have been out with folks that have done summer cover crops, and you may have things like sunflower or buckwheat or sun hemp or whatever, all of these things are allowed through this practice. We do have, because the SL8A has a wide variety of options in terms of when it might be fill a niche. We have separate planting lists designated for the spring, summer, and fall plantings. So different species options depending on when you're going to plant. Seed needs to be planted and certified within 45 days after the previous crop harvest or destruction. Again, the goal is to keep cover on the land. All seeding must be planted and certified no earlier than March 1st and no later than November 15th, again, depending on the season. 60% cover has to be maintained. As y'all have noted, this is a pretty standard fact in VACS that 60% cover needs to be maintained in all of our cover crop practices. And then the cover will be left on the land, unincorporated or incorporated, depending on the producer's choice. Rates-wise, this particular practice was created with sort of a sliding scale because it is going to fit so many different scenarios, some short, some long, depending on whether this was a pre-planned summer cover crop or meant to fill the gap that comes up after a crop failure or a storm or whatever. We did a tiered approach. So essentially, when the participant signs up, there's 3 different rates. If the producer already knows when he signs up, or he or she signs up, how long that cover crop's going to be in the ground approximately, sign them up accordingly. So if they know that, in 100 days, they're going to be planting their next commodity crop, well, you can go ahead and sign them up in that $20 an acre rate range. However, if the producer doesn't know, my advice is to sign them up at that $25 an acre rate. And then if it ends up not being quite as long later, when that practice is finished and certified, you can pay at the lower rate. All right, so there's more to the practice, certainly, but that's what we wanted to cover this morning before we really got into the meat and potatoes of the issue, which is SL8B. Oh, and a quick note before I forget.
Can I actually pause you before that slide? Wayne has a question for you.
Sure.
Yes.
Go ahead.
David, a question has come in. Why does the SL8A practice require conservation plan when other cover crop BMPs do not? That's the first question.
Sure.
And then the second one is a little bit different question. If a producer harvests corn for silage, say around Labor Day, and then applies manure according to his or her nutrient management plan around September 20th, then plants a cover crop on October 5th, does this count as nutrients at planting?
So I'm going to work in reverse. As far as the manure issue goes, SL8A does allow manure application, which is, again, unusual compared to some of our other specs, as long as the application is made in accordance with the nutrient management plan by a certified planner. So that is allowed. As far as the behind the scenes goes, in terms of Bay model credit and so forth, at this time, the SLA 8A does not get credit. One of our long-term issues with the VACS program is sometimes our TAC has these great ideas for new specs, but we have to prove it to the Bay program in order for them to start counting it for credit. So a lot of our cover crops, SL8B, SL8H, WQ4, get the credit through the Bay model. SL8A does not at this point. So anyway, it's one of our long-term goals to get some of these new and unique practices creditable. Same goes for NM7, which we're about to talk about. As far as the issue with conservation plans, I'll step back a second and just say, conservation planning in general should be the base for everything. When we are working with the farmer, when the conservation specialist is working with the farmer on the ground, it's important to hear their plan, hear their goals, what they want to do, address, taking account of the resource issues on the land and which practices can best address those. With that said, there are certain VACS practices, a handful or two, especially in the agronomic side of things, that do not require a full conservation plan. The SL8A and SL8B, comes to mind. SL8H, WQ4, they do not. And a lot of that is that DCR recognizes basically the level of BMP implementation that's required to reduce the pollution that we need to in our goals. I mean, it's a ton of work. It's a ton of extra administrative time and effort required by the districts implementing these practices. And some of these practices, like SL8B, are fairly routine practices. So the farmers sign it up every year, year after year, or at least every time they're coming in after corn. Whereas SL8A, on the other hand, is really a niche practice, whether it be a pre-planned summer cover crop or filling in a gap after a storm hits or something else. It requires a little bit more long-term planning. When this was created, I know there's been some conversations amidst some of the folks that were involved in the creation of this practice. And, I think everybody agrees that this practice requires more hand-in-hand work with the farmer because it's not something that's typically done. So it does require a conservation plan.
I think some of the pushback has come from small produce farmers, especially crop, who typically sometimes don't participate in programs. And maybe there's an opportunity there to educate them on the value of a conservation plan.
Sure, absolutely.
So I want to swing back just won't take but a second, but the previous question that came in, I wanted to make sure that was relating, going back to the one about the manure, does it count as nutrients at plant? And that's relating to the SL8B or the SL8H doesn't require a plan. So anyway, could you elaborate on that? I reckon is the response the same that you gave earlier?
When that was, it was before my time when this came on. But my understanding is that that we have a allowance of 300 acres where you can use manure with the SL8H. As long as there's three conditions. One is that the animals are raised as part of the applicant's operation. In other words, it's on-farm manure. Two is that an adequate manure storage is available for the winter. And then three is that there are no vegetated acres available to safely utilize the manure. And that manure has to be applied in accordance with the nutrient management plan. Those acres that we allow manure on, we do not get to report. So it was a compromise that was made some years ago. Bob, if you have any historic knowledge that you can jump in. But my understanding is that, again, while we can report SL8H, we cannot report it if there are manure on it. So there was a compromise made that the first 300 acres, we can use it, we just won't report it. And then after that, it cannot be used.
Thank you, David.
Sure. Okay, speaking of manure, NM7 is our cover crop for managing liquid or semi-solid manure. This is a very intense nutrient management spec. We classified it as an NM spec. It's specifically for on-farm generated manure, and it's really meant to help liquid and semi-solid generating operations improve their nutrient management. There are a ton of details. We went over them last year for those who are at the June VACS updates. We're not, it could be a talk in and of itself, but it's a very niche practice applying to those that are producing their own manure. And it really is meant more for on the nutrient management side, utilizing a cover crop as part of a greater system. Just wanted to note that because the title has cover crop in it, but we're utilizing it more in the nutrient management world. Okay, of course, the two are so intricately linked. SL8B is really our go-to option. As we mentioned earlier, the official title, small grain and mixed cover crop for nutrient management and residue management. It's the Commonwealth's premier go-to option for serving farmers by the implementation of cover crops. This is the big one, and as I think before the break, we had that question about Bay model credit. This is where we get the large majority of Bay model credit in the East. This and as well as our nutrient management efforts. So it is extremely important in our Eastern districts. All right. Obviously, it's, as you'll know, it's intended primarily as a fall or winter cover crop. It's usually planted following the harvest of corn, but I do want to make the point, and Chris and Bob talked about this a little bit. It's not easy to get in SL8B behind beans, but there is a misunderstanding sometimes in the field that this is only for after corn, and that's not correct. This can be used after beans. Again, beans are just in the field later, so it may not be feasible, but that is a in the field feasibility issue and not a programmatic issue. It's intended to parallel and be subject to NRCS standard 340 in all cases, and this is really parallels. Chris and I had some discussions about the SL8H. SL8H obviously does not follow the NRCS standard 340 because of the harvestable issue. Soil loss requirements. Russell 2 calculations are required to be run and documented, included in the participant's case file, as we try to manage soil loss along with improving water quality. If some of the districts are aware, because we realize how many times you'll have to run Russell or work with your NRCS partners to do so, and we know NRCS obviously has new tools with Conservation Desktop. As a long-term project, DCR is looking to find a way to run this the universal soil loss equation and tracking. The goal is to have something in our tracking module where you can go in and map the practice, and it'll be able to calculate soil loss internally and get a rough number. So that's yet to come. We're still seeing feasibility. It's been on the table for a year or so, a year or two. But we're hoping in the next year or two it can come to some resolution. All right, nutrients. No nutrients are allowed. This is big. You know, we talked about it a little bit with the manure issue and SL8H. Currently, none of the cover crops that we report, if you add manure, you can't report those acres in the current offerings in VACS. No nutrients are allowed between the harvest of the previous crop and March 1st of the following year. And the producer, as mentioned before, has to be fully implementing a current nutrient management plan on all acreage within the fields that this practice will be implemented on. So the nutrient management plan is the gateway, and then SL8B, after we get through that gateway, is our major practice, especially in our eastern counties. Species options, went ahead and just pasted this in from the manual. There's a wide variety, whether, you know, a lot of folks just do straight rye, and some of that is program driven, no doubt. But obviously, I mean, I myself am a huge fan of when you can get radishes in the mix, and other things that are really help from a soil health perspective and breaking up the soil and creating that nice spongy texture. But anyway, Chris and Bob earlier talked about the importance of seed to soil contact. And while it's not specifically mentioned in the spec, and specific seeding depths also aren't mentioned, part of your role as a conservation planner is being knowledgeable about these issues and giving good advice to the planners. We do have just sort of a disclaimer in the VACS program. Here's at the bottom, it says higher seeding rates are recommended for aerial seeding and non-incorporation seeding methods, aka broadcasting. When you're working with the farmer, it's important that you, as I echo what Bob said, if you have, as you have time, working with them in the field to figure out, what are their goals, what are they facing, what are the challenges that they've got on the plate, and as such, what is the best species to solve the issue? Is it straight rye? Is it a mix? And what's the best way to get the cover crop on? Is it drilled? Is it aerial? Is it broadcast? And depending on what they are choosing for, maybe it's an equipment-based issue, you should be giving the proper recommendations regarding rates and depth and so forth. But I can't, in my previous work at NRCS and in another realm, I too was preaching a lot of seed to soil contact. It makes such a difference. Okay, we also have, because rye is sort of the go-to with SL8B, we have a list of approved rye options, and this will change as of program year 22. Elbin and Ryman have been added as of, again, this coming July. It's important to note, though, that if your participant comes in the door and has another indeterminate growth tetraploid rye that they want to work with, there is a general statement in the manual about that. And then if you really want something to rely on, you actually want the cover crop subcommittee to look at it. Typically, this is something that we would get some Virginia Tech advice on as well. If you have any interest in a new cultivar being added to our list, just send it on to the TAC next time that we are taking suggestions. So this year, again, Elbin and Ryman got added. Last year, Dura got added. So it's one of the things in the manual that does continually get updated based on the latest and greatest, so to speak. All right, this is pretty big news. Several years ago, I think it was 2018, maybe 2019, the Ag BMT Technical Advisory Committee, working with DCR, with some input from Virginia Tech and other partners, voted to extend our planting dates by 2 weeks. And it's been sort of in limbo ever since then, as we've been waiting to see sort of Bay program reactions. After some management discussions at DCR and with the Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, this spring, it was decided to move forward with these new planting dates as of July 1st of this year. So the cities of Chesapeake and Virginia Beach, those are the only dates that did not change. Our early date is November 10th. Our standard is November 30th. But for the coastal plain, Piedmont, and the Mountain Valley regions, all of these have been moved back into the fall, further into the fall, by 2 weeks. And the reason is, it's due to climatic trends. We're getting warmer, wetter winters. Corn's not coming out into the field until later in general. And so we're seeing these issues where we're continually having to deal with the fact that people can't get cover crops in the field on time. Now, I really want to emphasize the fact that we still want to get it in as early as possible. We still want to encourage early dates. As Chris mentioned in his presentation, we want to get as much growth as possible early. From a VACS program perspective, we still have to reach 60% cover. Speaking of which, the 60% cover date has also been extended by 2 weeks to December 15th. The cover has to be checked by the district, and it has to be maintained through March 14th. So again, about 3 months or so. Pasturing is permitted on the SL8B as long as 60% cover is maintained. All right, when you get to the end of the cover crop's lifespan, so to speak, termination on the backside, harvesting for hay, haylage, silage, grain, straw, seed, whatever, is not permitted in any situation. Again, if a producer knows up front that they're going to need additional harvest of grain for whatever reason, they can sign up for the SL8H. They should not be signing up for the SL8B if they know this. The crop needs to be terminated either by grazing, mechanical, or chemical means. So, earlier, I know Bob and Chris talked about chemical methods. It also talked about using a roller crimper like the one here. It needs to occur no earlier than March 15th and then no later than June 1st. And it can be incorporated or left unincorporated on the field. And some of that, again, you'll see that some of our specs are flexible, and it's up to you as the conservation planner to be working to see what is best for that producer and meeting the conservation goal.
Hey, David,
Yes, sir.
just while you're on that one, if you could go back,
Sure.
a question has come in. Those dates that you just mentioned, those planting dates, will they apply to the SL8H practice as well?
Yes, sir. That's it. Yeah, it's a good question. Yep. Since we just hit the highlights on SL8H, I didn't get into it there, but you are correct. The SL8H dates will be extended as well.
Thanks.
Sure. All right. As far as payment goes, payment was just reworked as well as of this past program year. We have a 3-tiered approach. The base payment for the SL8B is $20 per acre. That is for our standard dates. However, there's 2 bonuses involved that a lot of producers, but not all, take advantage of. If the producer can get it in early, they sign up for an early planting. We give a $30 bonus. And again, that is the state's way of encouraging that cover crop to get in early and to get growing their roots and deal with excuse me, the scavenging of nitrogen as best as possible in those early days when it's planted. It's really, really important, especially in our days of strange weather, to get that in as soon as we can. And on a bay model side, since I've gotten those questions, we do get the most credit from these early plantings. So from a technical standpoint, we want early. From a programmatic and reporting standpoint, we want early. So that's quite a bonus. It more than doubles. And then lastly, we want to plant rye. When possible, we give a bonus. But I want to say that as a conservation planner, this isn't always the best fit for the producer and what they want to do. As I mentioned, tillage radishes and so forth earlier. I mean, there may be other fits for that producer. And so maybe the producer's goals are better met by doing a mix of rye and radish or rape or whatever. But they are going to take that hit on not getting that $10 an acre. So there are trade-offs, technical and financial. All right, so we gave a good overview, hopefully. Again, if any questions come in, Wayne, feel free to interrupt me, but there's some other things I know y'all wanted me to cover. Just about signups and other issues surrounding cover crops. So districts across Virginia, there's 47 soil and water conservation districts. Each district does things, a little bit differently. Some have continuous signups, basically from July 1 through June 30th of the following year, and just take applications as they go. And whatever they've got by their next board meeting, they'll rank them, and the best projects get the money. Other districts have specific sign-up periods, usually advertised in local newspaper or district newsletter or at the USDA office. And DCR does not mandate what your district wants to do. It's up to you. However, every applicant obviously needs to meet VACS eligibility requirements, and this is changing as of this new year. So it's yet another thing in PY22 starting on July 1 that will change. Assuming it passes the board, which I have no reason to think it won't, we will move to be eligible. You have to have 3 years of ag production. It used to be 5. As of today, if I walked into I live in the James River district, so if I walked into the James River office and signed up for a VACS practice, I would have to have 5 years of verifiable ag production on my land. That will change to 3. You have to have 5 or more contiguous acres with $1,000 worth or more of verifiable agricultural income. All right, the district obviously needs to receive what we call our contract part 1, as well as the W-9 tax form with matching information. Make sure all the forms line up and are equivalent. You can't have someone sign up as an entity on the contract part 1 and then as an individual on the W-9, and it all needs to match up. All right, district technical committees. Some districts have a technical committee, some don't. It varies across the state, but especially for those larger districts that deal with a lot of contracts, it's a really good idea to have a select group of board members that make up a separate, it's almost like a subcommittee to review the cover crop applications or other applications before they go to the full board. All of the applications need to be ranked according to priority and secondary considerations. For those in the NRCS world, it's basically our equivalent of ranking questions. District boards need to formally approve those contracts at their monthly meetings. The technical committee cannot do the formal approval, but it can make recommendations to the board. And then the district staff should send participants an approval letter that clearly lists which fields have been approved. This is really important. A lot of, especially our larger producers, may be applying for SL8B and NM1A and some of our other practices on thousands of acres within a given district. So it's important to let them know, which fields ranked out and where they're approved to move forward. All right, I want to focus in on one statement that's in the VACS manual that comes up from time to time. It's important to understand what it means. BMPs initiated prior to submitting an application are not eligible. So what that means is if a farmer goes out and plants his cover crop and then comes in to the district and says, hey, I want some money for this cover crop I just planted. I got a big seed bill and so forth, and I need some help. Well, unfortunately, at that point, it's too late. The district can always provide technical assistance, but if they've already initiated that practice before signing up, it's too late. However, and this is utilized a lot in the cover crop land, I do not recommend anybody with structural practices do this. If a participant submits an application, so they submit their contract part 1, and they proceed with the cover crop practice, even if they're not formally approved, that's okay. It's just that the district cannot assure them that they're going to be funded. It's basically they move forward at their own risk, so to speak. As long as the participant follows the spec and the district checks for 60% cover, the district can approve funding later in the year. So what we're dealing with, the big issue or the big elephant in the room is cover crop cancellations. So just to give you a very simple example, if a district has enough funds to fund 1,000 acres worth of SL8B, but they get 2,000 acres worth of sign up, well, you get approved contracts for those first 1,000 acres, the highest ranking practices, send those approval letters out to those farmers. Inevitably, due to weather or whatever, we know that some of those contracts are going to end up coming back as canceled. So let's say half of it does, and you have 500 acres worth of dollars that are freed up. If some other producers had turned in their applications and have been following the spec and planted on time and reached 60% cover, and the district had checked it and everything had gone according to the VACS manual plan, then the district can go back and fund those practices, even though they've already been initiated, because the contract part one was in hand before they started. So this happens a lot in the East. I know there's plenty of districts that are already doing this. This probably isn't anything new to you. I will say that sometimes the districts in the West don't necessarily know about this. It is a really bad idea when it comes to structural practices. So if you're signing up someone for a stream exclusion practice, again, you can't guarantee that that person's going to get funded. Also, we have our resource review issues where we have to deal with threatened and endangered species and so forth. So, you know, if someone chooses to move forward before they're funded, you know, it's highly likely that they may not be able to get funding at all. So definitely not something to recommend, but in the cover crop world, it works. On the bottom, I just wanted to add that districts really need to have a plan for cover crop cancellations. And some districts have gotten really creative, and I appreciate that. I won't name this district, but there's one that I've talked to in the past couple months that had a bunch of cover crop cancellations and have decided that they want to put their money towards stream bank stabilization projects in their district. And I think that's very commendable. Sometimes we all have our favorite practices. We all sort of can get in a rut at times. So, you know, have a backup of practices that you can work with. If your cover crops get majorly hit due to weather, happening more and more and more often, are there other practices that you can have in your back pocket to work with farmers on? I mean, VACS has like over 50 different practices available to work with producers to meet their water quality goals. So I would encourage some of those districts that do a lot of nutrient management and cover crop, and that's very important, you know, just to start branching out a little bit. And when you have years with a high allocation, I know program year 20 it looks like program year 22 might be a good year of allocation as well. You know, take advantage of those extra funds and do something new. If you don't know, you know, how to get a certain practice in, you know, reach out to neighboring districts, reach out to DCR, our engineering services team, whoever would be the best expert, so to speak. But have a plan. That's what it comes down to in the end. All right. One last thing I wanted to quickly cruise through. I know we've got running out of time. I'm going to check the time real quick. Let's see. Okay. Got about 10 minutes. We all know and mentioned over and over, you know, weather is a huge issue when it comes to cover crops. And so there are options for local boards to address cover crop planting dates, as we discussed earlier, when an extreme act of nature occurs. This is actually a shelf cloud that's in the greater Richmond area, obviously not in the city. I'm not sure which county this is, probably some like Hanover. But anyway, we get some crazy storms that have been occurring the last couple of years and the amount of rainfall. As of this past year, some changes were made to the manual regarding extreme acts of nature. So this is truly for the unusual circumstance that is becoming more and more common, unfortunately. District boards of directors do have the ability to authorize a one-time per planting season extension of 14 days beyond the standard planting dates. This does not apply to early planting dates. You know, the earlier set and they're reported as early up to the Bay program. This is only for our standard dates where we get less credit. When the standard planting dates are extended, so too are the performance criteria dates, also extended by 2 weeks. And we still have to meet 60% cover. So there's going to be years where the rain is so bad that the farmers can't get their crops out of the field, and even an extension won't really do much good. And it just is what it is. That's where a backup plan from the district perspective is really important. All right. In order to implement a extension, you can either go off of a documented disaster designation from the governor or an FSA disaster declaration in order to extend cover crop planting dates in an entire county, city, or jurisdiction. That doesn't happen a lot. More often, it's what we're about to talk about. On a HUC by HUC level, and we're usually talking about the HUC 6 hydrologic unit codes, they're listed in the VACS manual. The board of directors can extend these planning dates HUC by HUC as long as they've got two things. First of all, they have to have a local credible source clearly document the issue at hand. Virginia Cooperative Extension is usually that credible source, or the local AREC. We worked with Dr. Dan Gerlich on this. His agent should be aware of this. We know that one agent sits on every board, or most of our boards in across Virginia. So that local agent is key to this process. Additionally, there has to be documentation from a professionally recognized climatology expert, which clearly references the extreme act of nature circumstance. So that could be our state climatology office here in Virginia. In cases of drought, we've used the United States Drought Monitor or the Palmer Drought Severity Index. In cases of extreme rains, I know that I had a district or two this past year utilize data from NOAA. And I would say it's really important, if you're declaring an extreme act of nature, to compare the current issues based on what is normal. So in other words, don't just say, well, I had 20 inches of rain this year. Okay, well, what is that compared to a normal year? Is that a drought? Is that a monsoon? You need to have some backup. This needs to be very well documented, and really should be something that is very rare for the district to pursue. All right, this is only for SL8B practices. Again, that can be done on a HUC by HUC basis. Farmers don't need to apply for this anymore. That's a change. Basically, once the board makes the action, it'll apply to all relevant contracts. And the Ag Incentives Program Manager, myself, has to be notified anytime this is done. As for other cover crop practices, like our Harvestable, our NM7, WQ4, the director of DCR, so that's Director Clyde Chrisman, has the ability to extend these dates in consultation with the Virginia Soil and Water Conservation Board. That is an extremely rare thing that we would do, but it did happen 2 or 3 years ago. So anyway, that is a state and a Soil Water Conservation Board issue, not a local board issue. And I know we're pretty much out of time, so I'm going to stop there. If anybody has any questions for me or Chris or Bob, please shoot.
David, we got about 5 minutes. One question, going back to the SL8H, grazing would be considered harvesting, correct?
Correct.
All right. All right. Any more?
No, not in the
Other questions from our meeting participants? Kendall, you gonna have any? I'm gonna have some closing time. You have any?
No, go ahead.
All right, I'd like to just at this time, if there's no more questions, I'd like to thank all the meeting participants for your time, your interest, and your participation. I also like to thank Chris, Bob, and David, our speakers. I think they all did a wonderful job, and I appreciate them taking their time and being with us. And I look forward to hopefully working with them on some future topics. I'd like to put a plug in for a training session that Kendall and I and others are working on April 7th. I think you probably have noticed this on the association website. It's going to be a precision ag nutrient management training session. It'll be held from 1 o'clock to 4 o'clock. Again, that date is April 7th. And it's my understanding, we've been working with Dave Kindig and Carl, and continuing credits hopefully will be offered. Another quick comment, going back to some of the new planting dates that were shared by David, our last speaker. One thing that came to my mind, I reckon, being on both sides of the field, so to speak, one thing that you have at your disposal now, when this goes into effect July 1, is you've got an opportunity to meet with those farmers to get some additional acres behind soybeans, because by moving these dates, that's going to open up that opportunity for that farmer, he or she, to consider that, plus some of those corn crops that have traditionally have come in late due to weather conditions, wet conditions, or whatever. So
Yeah, Wayne, I'll just interrupt for a second. I would second what you just said. Absolutely. In fact, one of the issues that had come to the TAC this past year was the potential development of a cover crop after soybeans. And honestly, Bob and I have talked about it. We're really hopeful, just like you said, that now with the cover crop planting dates being pushed back, we may be able to see more signups to the SLAB. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. And I think, again, I always learn from these sessions. It's like I think Chris said it best. You learn something every day. And I've planted a lot of cover crops in my day and on our family farm. But the one thing that I'm taking back today is I really like the way that it was framed by Chris, is the response. I think he used the word, it depends. And that really can carry you a long way as a conservation specialist or extension agent or a district conservationist. When you go there and you're trying to probe and understand more of that person's operation, it's important that you listen, but also ask some probing questions, and you might be able to get in a few more acres. And I strongly suggest something that Chris mentioned. Don't try to get, 100 acres or 500 acres of cover crop if they've never participated, but maybe start off getting 10 or 20 or whatever. Start small scale so you can prove to that operator that cover crops do pay off. And another take home message that I learned today is, I think Bob mentioned it, is that cover crop, he's treating it just like a cash crop, whether it be, wheat or barley. That's very important. And that's something you can talk to that operator about as well, and making sure they understand all those benefits. The more you're educated on this practice, the better you're going to sell it out in the field. And that's one reason that I'm glad Kendall and her team was very receptive to us putting this type of session on, and the one that we have coming up on April 7th. I think we owe it to not only the new elected employees, whatever agency they may work with, or new directors that have come on a district board. We owe it to them to educate them about what they're getting involved in and how we can make them more valuable so they can talk up these programs in the best way. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this session, if things go the way we hope and we can get with our speakers, we may have what I call it, for lack of better terms, maybe a next more advanced session on cover crops down the road, whether it be fall, winter, or next spring. If we get good input from y'all, when we send some additional materials out to y'all based on this session today, we may have an advanced course on it, because I know Chris, it's high on his radar, and it's high on mine and Kendall's. I reckon with that, I'd like y'all to be safe, enjoy the rest of the week, and again, thank all of y'all.
We will